Well, good morning, everyone. It's 9 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining our webinar on after the LNU fire. We have about 260 people on the webinar from many locations across the state, mostly from Napa, Solano, and Yolo counties, but also people as far north as Siskiyou and Del Norte, and also as far south as Riverside and Los Angeles. We put this webinar together real quickly in a matter of just a couple of weeks to get everything organized. It was a collaborative effort by many people from UC Cooperative Extension, ag commissioners from Napa, Solano, Yolo counties, RCDs, Resource Conservation Districts from the same 3 counties, and USDA offices from the same counties. So really appreciate everyone's work on getting this together so quickly. And of course, lots of support from the UCCE program support unit on all the behind the scenes management of the webinar. And so they'll be working in the background throughout the webinar, keeping everyone on task and things running smoothly. This webinar, it is being recorded and will be posted on many websites, any of the same agencies that I just mentioned. We'll have the recording available probably within a day of this webinar. We will cover information primarily for small to large property owners and ag operations recovery efforts with a focus on natural resource issues and concerns. So it is a very limited amount of time, so we can't cover everything that's really important for everyone. We will not be discussing or covering fire preventive strategies in this webinar, nor emergency response aspects or insurance issues. Those would be topics for perhaps other webinars. I mean, we know there are a lot of important issues. We're going to focus on the information that we felt was important, and questions were being asked from small acreage landowners and ag operators. So during this webinar, we'll have 9 presentations. We'll have a short break about halfway through. The target time is about 10:45 for the break. It'll just be a short 5-minute bio break. And we will have time for questions after each one of our sessions. Our target is to have about 5 minutes of question and answer periods after each presenter or each presentation. But we'll also have time at the end of the webinar to address questions that we didn't get to at the end of each session. So what you can do, and we will plan on concluding at 12:30. If there are additional questions, we will continue on for another 10 or 15 minutes to be sure to field those questions. But we'll give some concluding remarks at 12:30. So all participants to the webinar will remain muted throughout the webinar. If you want to ask a question, please use the question and answer feature to submit questions. Do not submit them on the chat. You can use the chat to submit comments, maybe important resources that might be useful for people. And you can find the question and answer in chat. If you just move your cursor over the screen, you can see at the bottom there's a Q&A, and there's also a chat feature. You just click that and you'll be able to see how to submit a question or a chat submission. We will have poll questions like the one you just saw. You're seeing the results of the first poll question. And we will have additional poll questions, typically one after each session and then another one towards the end of the webinar. And we'll also have an evaluation that we really appreciate it. You can give us some feedback on how we did, and also in that evaluation is information that will be helpful for a lot of the agencies on addressing the issues that you guys raise. So with that, we'll get started. I just wanted to just thank you again. And I know this has been really a hard situation for so many of us, so many of you who have been directly affected, and so many of us who have been seeing all the devastation. Our hearts go out to everyone who was affected by this. So to lead off, we have a session on navigating the agencies, and it is often like an alphabet soup with all the acronyms. So we wanted to give some attention to that issue so that you can understand the processes that are involved in emergency responses and disaster assistance responses. And for that, we have Robyn with the Solano County Office of Emergency Services, and she's been so busy lately because she's been on call and active in the Solano County Emergency Operations Center. And we really appreciate you, Robyn, taking the time from your busy schedule. And also we have Wynne from the United States Small Business Administration. So with that, I'll hand it over to Robyn.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I am going to be brief, and I understand that there are people from other counties beyond just Solano County here. So please understand that every county is a little unique in how they deal with local emergency and proclamations of emergency, and who has the authority to declare or proclaim an emergency within their jurisdiction or operational area, which encompasses the entire county. That authority is within county code, and it is formalized within our county's emergency operations plan, which is an EOP. Every county that's on this call probably has one, and it would be available most likely online if you did want to look that up. So for Solano County, in order to proclaim a local emergency, the people that are allowed to do that here are the county administrator, the sheriff, the emergency services manager, which is my direct boss, or the public health officer. And again, that authority comes within county code. It is subject to ratification within 7 days of the Board of Supervisors. And by doing so, we can request state and federal assistance in our local proclamation of emergency or disaster, and it will move up through the state process. So everything happens at different levels. So everything from local goes to state, everything from state goes to federal. Locals do not go straight to federal. So we request state and or federal assistance within our local proclamation of emergency, and then the state will evaluate whether or not they are going to declare an emergency as well. And they can do that for one or more counties, or they can do it for the entire state, like what is happening with COVID. And then they may or may not request assistance from a federal level. So for this incident, we do have a federal declaration of emergency or disaster. So with that, we receive, or certain programs become available to us that offer financial aid to individuals, homeowners, renters, and businesses. And Kevin's going to speak to some of those business opportunities available as well. Specific to ag, you guys this community can have an emergency or a disaster that doesn't necessarily impact the rest of the community in the same way. So there is a process where a declaration or disaster designation can be requested specifically related to ag through USDA. And that process, again, comes from the local level requesting through the state that the U.S. Department of Agriculture secretarial disaster declaration be made. And then that process works back down, and it also opens up certain programs available to the community. So I am going to make sure that you all hopefully have already signed up for FEMA assistance. Anyone that's been impacted by this disaster, not just those that lost their homes, but anyone impacted in Solano County and any county really should be registering for FEMA. Even if you have insurance, there are circumstances where your insurance coverage is not enough to cover whatever your losses are. And in that case, there's opportunities for assistance through FEMA. And you can do that in 3 ways. FEMA has a website, it's disasterassistance.gov. They also have a telephone number, which is 1-800-621-3362, or they have an app that's available on Apple or Android. You can download the app and apply for FEMA assistance. We are offering in Solano County through our local assistance center at 675 Texas Street in Fairfield, assistance signing up for FEMA, as well as information on other state and federal programs, as well as the local programs, including resource management and environmental health, which is the biggest push right now as we work through debris removal. Specifically for FEMA assistance, there is something called critical needs assistance, and that is immediate $500 that can go to those that qualify, that have immediate needs for food, shelter, or other needs that has a deadline. So you have to register. They just extended the deadline to September 12th. So if you want to see if you qualify for critical needs assistance, make sure you sign up for FEMA, disasterassistance.gov, for critical needs assistance by September 12th. I'm going to pass it over now to Kevin with SBA, and I'm hopefully going to be available later at the end of this call to answer any questions. So thank you all. Sincerest apologies for everyone that lost property and impacted by this disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. And as Robyn mentioned, when the state does request federal assistance, the United States Small Business Administration activates the disaster recovery program that we operate. Next slide, please. And SBA's role in disaster recovery. We help homeowners, renters, businesses of all sizes, and private nonprofit organizations begin the recovery process from this disaster. The disaster losses are those that are not covered by insurance or any other recoveries, such as the FEMA assistance or any other kind of grants that are received. So basically, it's uninsured and underinsured losses for the primary residents only, and for renters, it'd be any of their personal property, and also for homeowners, their personal property. Businesses as well, machinery and equipment, furniture and fixtures, things like that that are physically impacted by this fire or this disaster. Next slide, please. What we do after, as Robyn mentioned, we assess damages after a disaster, and what those are called are preliminary damage assessments. They're done in conjunction with the state, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and SBA. And what we do is we go door to door, or in this case, we'll probably do flyovers because there was such heavy damage from the structures and the smoke was still billowing that we probably did it that way. But if it meets the Federal Emergency Management Agency's criteria, then the president will declare the disaster. Next slide, please. When the state does request the preliminary damage assessment, local agencies as well as tribal also participate in disasters. What you're seeing on the screen now is, of course, not fire damage, but tornadoes, any other kind of disaster, hurricanes. FEMA, SBA, and the local agencies go to these places and do the preliminary damage assessments. Next slide, please. In a presidential declaration, there's many federal agencies, and FEMA is the coordinating agency. They're like the umbrella of the entire federal alphabet soup, as Morgan mentioned earlier. FEMA will declare it for individual assistance, which provides aid to the individuals, which is what that means, and households, and public assistance is for the infrastructure, for the state and local governments. Generally, they're done separate declarations as well. Next slide, please. And it has to go up to the president to sign these individual assistance and public assistance declarations. In this case, President Trump already has declared this disaster, and there's many other counties across the state of California that more than likely will get individual assistance for these fires. So when he does declare it, like I mentioned, SBA's disaster loan program is activated for businesses of all sizes, private nonprofit organizations, homeowners, and renters in affected counties. Next slide, please. And for the smaller disasters where it doesn't meet the FEMA criteria, SBA's administrator, in this case, Jovita Carranza, can activate an agency declaration. And this also activates SBA's physical and economic injury disaster loan programs. Next slide, please. We make this administrative declaration, and it's a little bit less criteria than the FEMA if there's 25 damaged homes and or businesses that sustained 40% or more of uninsured or underinsured property damage losses. It's a lot less than the FEMA criteria, and it gets the program activated. And it's the same program that's activated in a presidential declaration, which I will describe later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. And the differences in presidential and agency declarations. When FEMA has declared a presidential declaration, SBA disaster physical loans are for the primary counties, and economic injury disaster loans are for the contiguous counties, which are those contiguous counties are the ones that touch the primary county. In an SBA agency declaration, both physical and economic injury disaster loans are available in both the primary and the contiguous counties. This is very important in the fact that contiguous counties in a presidential declaration are not eligible for physical injury losses. Only economic injury losses in presidential declarations in those contiguous counties. Next slide, please. And the types of disaster declarations, as I'm starting to mention, are the presidential, individual, or public assistance, and you get physical and economic injury for that. And for the economic injury disaster loans, SBA offers other kinds of programs. Governor certification, that is where 5 businesses have suffered economic injury. Secretary of Agriculture, mainly that's for drought declarations. Secretary of Commerce are basically for fishery declarations, such as a salmon run not coming up to a certain harvest criteria for the season. And military reservist economic injury disaster loans. Next slide, please. And SBA's disaster loans are for physical damages from a declared disaster for more than just small businesses. They're for non-farm businesses of all sizes, as I've mentioned, homeowners, renters, and private nonprofit organizations. The United States Department of Agriculture helps the ag community. SBA can help homes on farms and the personal property contained in that primary residence, but we don't do anything with the ag business. United States Department of Agriculture or the FSA assist those ag businesses. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the economic injury disaster loans are available to the non-farm businesses, agricultural cooperatives, and small businesses engaged in aquaculture and most private nonprofits. What they do is they help meet the working capital needs of the business. They're not there to replace lost revenue, but they're there to keep the notes payable paid, the employees employed, and the lights on. They're working capital loans to get a small business through the disaster recovery period. Next slide, please. And here is our maximum amount of the loans for the businesses, and this is private nonprofits as well, up to $2 million at very low interest rates, which I'll go over. The economic injury disaster loans, which I mentioned, are working capital loans. They're not there to replace lost revenue. Any combination of an economic injury or a physical business loan is the maximum of $2 million. For the homeowners to repair or replace the primary residence, we can loan up to $200,000. For homeowners and renters, for the personal property, up to $40,000. And we also offer mitigation once you've been approved for the program, which would be 20% of the verified damage of the business or the home, the primary residence. Next slide, please. And we, of course, require hazard insurance to, if you are approved for an SBA disaster assistance loan. If you're in a special flood hazard area, we'll require flood insurance as well, just to mitigate in the future so there doesn't need to be any kind of additional loans if the disaster was to occur again. These are taxpayer subsidized loans at a very low interest rate. Next slide, please. Low criteria for these loans, we're looking at just the eligibility, which basically is the damaged property must be in a declared county. That would be Solano, Napa, any of the counties that have been declared. There's 7 or 8 right now, I believe. The credit history has to have been acceptable to SBA. We recognize that these folks have been in a disaster, so SBA's, we look at their underwriting criteria of the applicant and recognize that since they've been in the disaster through no fault of their own, we'll do a little bit more leniency when we're looking at their applications. Repayment, if they show the ability to repay all the loans, that's the third criteria as well. So very, very low loan criteria for these SBA disaster loans. Next slide, please. And we have low interest rates, long terms, 15 to 30 years, which makes recovery very affordable. And we can refinance in some cases prior debt, such as a current mortgage, and bring it down to the low interest rate, which I'll go over. Next slide, please. And here are the interest rates which occur on or after July 31st. For the home, it's 1.18%. For businesses, 3%. For those economic injury disaster loans, 3% as well. And for the private nonprofits, 2.75%. The no credit available elsewhere means that this is the 80 or 90% of our loans are made at these rates. Credit available elsewhere means that SBA has determined that the business or the homeowner has the available resources and doesn't need a taxpayer subsidized loan. If they do qualify though, the rate is a little bit higher, as you can see on the screen. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we can refinance recorded liens on real estate and in businesses, machinery and equipment and furniture and fixtures as well. Business loans, the real estate and the chattel. Next slide, please. For the collateral, we won't deny a loan if there's no collateral available, but if collateral is available, we will take it. Physical loans over $25,000, of course, require the collateral. Economic injury disaster loans over $25,000 as well. Next slide, please. And very easy application process. We're running these virtually now due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So if folks want to apply online, they can go to the disasterloan.sba.gov/ELA. Very easy. If you just go out to sba.gov, you can find our electronic loan application and apply online. Next slide, please. And you have 60 days from the declaration date of this disaster. And for the economic injury, we know that it takes businesses a little bit longer to get their financials in order, so we give them 9 months from the declaration date. The declaration date was August 21st, so they have until October 21st to apply for the physical, and May 24th, 2021 for the economic injury. In these presidential declarations, FEMA may extend the filing deadline, especially with the current fires going on, and those other counties may be declared presidential declarations. The deadline may be extended, and SBA and FEMA will let you know by issuing a press release. Next slide, please. The three-step process: you apply for the loan, the property is verified, step 2, and a loan processing decision made, and then we close the loan and funds are dispersed. Usually it takes 10 to 14 days for this process to occur. The quicker you get your application in, the quicker SBA can process it and get the funds into your account. Next slide, please. We also have SBA resource partners, Veterans Business Outreach Centers, Women's Business Centers, Small Business Development Centers, and SCORE, Service Corps of Retired Executives. Businesses can go to these places for free counseling on operational, financial, and marketing plans and ways to reduce costs and how to spend the loan that they do qualify for. We recognize that in a disaster that the business plan of any business will change, so we encourage businesses to go to these places and get the counseling that's going to help them going forward in terms of their business operability. Next slide, please. And the ODA referrals, what we do is the public information officers do outreach to the chambers, congressional briefings. We distribute resource partner flyers. We also open up business recovery centers, local assistance centers, and we also do outreach calls to businesses and residents from our SBA Customer Service Center. Next slide, please. And here's our numbers, 800-659-2955. As I mentioned, just go to sba.gov/disaster. and email is down there below as well, disastercustomerservice@sba.gov. It's a great program for folks to start recovering from the fires that have occurred here in Northern California and pretty much all over the state as well. We work hand in hand with FEMA in assisting people to recover from these disasters. Next slide, please. And Robyn and I will entertain questions now on what we have both talked about.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I'm Wendy Rash with Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm just moderating the questions. There were not a whole lot of questions that came through this time. There was one quick one. Robyn, I don't know if you have information about the emergency notifications. There was a question about why residents in Pleasants Valley did not receive an emergency call. So I don't know if you are able to address that.
Hi, yes. So there are, I can tell you that emergency notifications went out. We sent a number of emergency notifications that encompassed that area throughout the evening into the early morning hours and the following afternoon. But there are reasons why potentially residents didn't receive notification, including we had some significant power outages occurring in the area. And if you have a telephone, like if your home phone is a VoIP phone, which means your phone service is over your internet. So think if it's bundled with your internet package, then you have to have battery backup on your phone. Otherwise, when you lose power, you will lose your internet and your telephone. So when I send a reverse 911 call to your home phone, it might not go through. Additionally, we did send messaging out through cell phones via call, text, and then additionally email for the people that have signed up to receive emergency notifications through Alert Solano. So those also went through. However, that process, when you sign up, you decide how you want those messages to come in. So anyone that decided they wanted messaging by text and email, but not necessarily calls, it would only come in the way in which it was set up by the person when they opted in. On top of that, there are just other factors like I know we heard from a couple of people who received messaging, but their phones on Do Not Disturb at night, which caused issues for that message getting through. So messaging there's a lot involved in messaging, but I can assure you that a significant number of messages that encompass that area were sent through the Alert Solano system to reach residents as quickly as possible, as well as the use of a high-low siren by the law enforcement officers that were in the area, as well as them going door to door to assist in evacuations and getting people out. And then really any good system also relies on neighbor to neighbor. So there was a lot of neighbor to neighbor contact, which I see as a win because we did successfully get everyone out of that area with the exception of, unfortunately, the 2 lives that were lost. So I can answer any follow-up questions if there are.
Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. I think we're going to need to move to our next speaker, but thank you for that information, Robyn. That does help for us to all, check our settings on our cell phone to make sure those calls can get through and the settings on the alerts that we're signed up for. So thank you, Robyn, and thank you, Kevin. As more questions come through, we will address them at the end of the webinar, and it's time to move on to our next speaker. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Robyn and Kevin. And I believe Robyn needs to attend to some other business, but maybe joining us at the end of the program for the question and answer period at the end. And I think Kevin might be joining us for the entire period. Those questions, like Wendy said, that weren't answered, we'll try to get those in at the very end. And some of them might be answered as we move through the program. All right, so next up, we are going to have Rich Casale, and to talk about kind of give a high-level view of wildland fire impacts. And Rich is retired from the USDA Natural Resources and Conservation Service after 45 years serving that agency, and is now working on a contract basis. Rich was a district conservationist for NRCS in the Central Coast and has many years working on fire recovery issues. So Rich, thank you very much and take it away.
Thank you, and thank everybody for joining us this morning. Good morning to everyone. And yes, I'm also a certified professional erosion and sediment control specialist and have been for 40 years, working for NRCS, assisting NRCS in one number of capacities. I've assisted many property owners, all different sizes, from homeowners to large ranches, back into the mid-70s post-fire on numerous fires, and particularly in the last 5 years, all the fires we've had throughout California. I've been on many of them and have written many handouts and fact sheets and publications that are available on our NRCS website. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is available in written form. You can certainly email me, or you can contact NRCS directly, and the websites are at the end of my presentation. So I'm going to be speaking for the next 15 minutes or so on understanding wildfire impacts. To begin with, there's some overarching concepts I want to make sure everybody is aware of, keep in the back of your mind before deciding what to do and whether or not anything needs to be done at all. I always like to start with nature. I consider nature as our first and best post-fire restoration practice. Saying that, sometimes nothing is best. I know that's a hard pill to swallow for many, but it is a valid practice and sometimes the best thing that we can do. So we like to start off there. This is a photograph I took last year, about 3 or 4 weeks following the first rains in the Kincaid fire in Sonoma County. I wish I had the before picture of this, but basically everything that you see green in terms of the rangeland there was black and ash. And certainly you can see even some life coming back to some of the trees, although most of the trees in this area were heat or smoke damaged, and they will provide a lot of free mulch to us. So in terms of waiting on nature, that's one of the things that nature provides to us following fire is free mulch and free grass. A lot of grass seed is either sprouting from root systems, if they're perennials. There's seed bank in the soil that regerminates after fire. So we don't have to be too quick to think about aerial seeding or seeding areas that were torched by fire. So understanding some natural processes is important before, again, we jump to the chase and start thinking about everything that we can throw at the landscape following fire. Recognizing that fire is natural in the landscape, that nature is incredibly resilient given the chance. A lot of the practices that we do throw at the landscape after fire can actually slow that process down. So that's a very important point. For example, deep-rooted shrubs are providing more protection for slope stability after fire than new grass would. Let's keep in mind that since we have the time following these fires and previous fires I've worked on, even the Kincaid fire that was late in the fall, the Thomas fire in Santa Barbara I worked on, it didn't really go out until the first week of January. There was no time to plan. We have a little bit of time to plan. We don't have to be so quick to start removing anything from the landscape and making unnecessary disturbances. Recognize that soil erosion is a natural and landforming process, and it's always going on. And it was going on underneath all the trees and brush and what have you on some of our fire affected areas. So now it's going to just be a little more evident because we're going to be able to see it. And it will be perhaps more accelerated in some areas. The areas that were severely disturbed by the firefighting effort, where the fire burnt very intensely, where we have, deep ash and white ash on the soil and very little in the way of plant material left. Many plants are actually dependent on fire and regenerate as a result of fire. And some seed and plants will only come back after fire. So again, waiting on nature for plant regeneration and native seed bank germination is important, because these plants, like I said, are already there, as opposed to introducing something new. Not to say there's not a place for those practices. I may be able to touch a little bit on it in my presentation. There'll be others today that will also talk about some of these practices. So plants also in grasslands are stimulated and enhanced by fire as well. So some other things, I already mentioned leaf drop provides natural mulch, and the leaf drop is from typically plants that are not deciduous, but they're deciduous after fire because they were smoked or heat damaged. So if you're doing any straw mulching, for example, there's no need to be putting mulching under trees or around trees or any place that would be influenced by leaf drop or leaves being, blown over the landscape naturally. Ash, to some extent, provides some initial protection. It's very absorbent. It does develop a crust. It is a site situation. For people that are interested in seeding, again, I don't recommend it at least on a wide scale, but where it is recommended, keep in mind that you can't really seed ash. Nothing will come up in ash. And generally, seed is much more successful when you have seed bed preparation. Well, guess what? Seed bed preparation involves disturbance. So that's, again, that's almost a whole presentation on itself. Burned plants provide soil and slope protection, particularly ones that were just singed or even ones that were completely burned. Maybe there's only a skeleton of the plant left. But anything that protects the soil surface or still has a root system is doing something important for post-fire. If a raindrop hits even a burnt plant or a leaf or a stone on the surface, it's taking the energy out of a raindrop that's hitting the soil at in excess of 30 miles an hour and splashing that and breaking up that raindrop in many pieces and spreading out as much as 5 feet in any given direction. Fire-related debris in channels and streams can also be beneficial. Again, that's something's a site-specific call. We don't typically recommend that everything be removed from the channels. In some cases, again, that's nature's way of maybe slowing water down naturally or collecting sediment in a place in the watershed that might be a better place than, say, around a bridge or something of that nature. So understanding natural process is important, understanding the impact that the wildfire has had on soil, the soil type, the slope, understanding natural sheet flow of runoff, and trying to maintain or return that runoff to sheet flow. A lot of the fire breaks have rerouted natural drainage, and sometimes the water bars that are put into these fire breaks by CAL FIRE or the Forest Service actually concentrate and redirect and divert water unnecessarily. I've told landowners in many situations to remove the water bars or not to have CAL FIRE put them in at all. In many cases, removing the berms alongside the fire break to allow the water to stay in sheet flow is a much better idea. Understanding some of the basic erosion control, erosion factors, the importance of vegetative cover, the type of soil, the sandier soil types are more erosive, for example. Not only the steepness of the slope, but how long that slope is, has a degree of how much water and how fast the water is moving over the slope. The rainfall amount certainly is important, but rainfall intensity is probably more important, particularly after you've had ground saturation following rainfall events. And it doesn't take much to produce, well, it does take quite a bit to produce a debris flow, but in intensity, talking about intensity, the Montecito debris flow in 2018, there was a ½ inch of rain that fell in 5 minutes. That's equivalent to a 6-inch of rain an hour in intensity, and that produced a horrendous, killer debris flow that killed 22 people. And obviously, the human impact is an erosion factor as well. What we do or what we don't do, or how we do it on the landscape is going to have an effect on erosion. So some of the impact on soil includes that the fires can burn hotter, the higher intensity fires. They can destroy plants, the complete plant, the root systems and resident seed banks. The lower intensity fires typically burn cooler. There's generally better, regeneration in these areas, but they can also smolder and they can still have a severe impact on soil biological, physical, and chemical properties. Can also affect soil nutrients, erosion hazard, can alter the water holding capacity and overall soil health, which is important to know, particularly if you are planning to do seeding or replanting or understanding how well nature is going to play a role in the post-fire landscape. The cumulative effects of these changes can modify soil productivity and biological diversity for several years. So I always recommend getting a thorough post-fire assessment by a professional, and NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and resource conservation districts throughout the state are very helpful, and they're a free source of information. They're non-regulatory organizations that provide confidential assistance. So that might be a good first stop. But these are some of the things that will be assessed on a property visit before any determination of what kind of practices, if any, are needed. So fire history, when the last time fire was in this particular, on this particular property is important. Fire intensity and the severity, the degree of disturbance from the firefighting effort, where I tell folks that's a good place to start if you've had that, because a lot of issues arise following fire from the actual damage that was caused from the firefighting effort and dozer work. The presence of white ash, that's where it burned extremely hot, so the degree of damage is going to be higher in those areas. The degree of overall tree and plant loss, the damage to infrastructure, sorry for the spelling of that word, and the impact on soil and slopes. So these are some practices. The do nothing is using nature as your best management practices, as I mentioned earlier. No widespread seeding is really needed, particularly in wildland areas and larger open space areas, with the possible exception of range and pasture lands. And that's a case-by-case situation as well. Seeding may be advantageous around home sites, alongside roads and driveways, maybe as a buffer strip above important waterways. I like straw mulching, loose straw, no more than 2 inches thick, as ground protection, using rice straw or a weed-free or weed-limited, a sterile cereal grain straw. Anyway, there are handouts and additional details on straw mulching that are available through the NRCS website, so I can't go into a lot of detail. But in many cases, that's all that's necessary. People always want to know, what about those straw wattles? What about erosion control blankets? What about jute netting? Well, here's an example of it done wrong. There's plastic laid on the background of another property in the background you can see in this picture. These wattles were placed on top of jute netting, and jute netting was placed on bare soil over cut plant material. And so everything is done wrong here, and soil erosion is still going to occur underneath the jute netting. When you do use jute netting, it has to be on a very smooth and well-prepared slope, has to have good soil contact, and usually the netting is there to hold mulch in place. It doesn't do as the job that you want it to do unless there's mulch underneath it. Straw wattles need to be keyed in. These are not doing anything. They're just floating on top of the netting, and yet this landowner spent thousands and thousands of dollars for this job. So minimize tree cutting and plant removal. Many trees, if they're not presenting an immediate initial danger to life or structure, I would wait until at least next spring and assess whether or not they need to be cut at all. A lot of them will come back. So post-fire practices to really, spend some time and effort on are looking at drainage systems that have been impacted, including road culverts that may have been burnt out, which were probably plastic in some cases in a lot of our rural areas. Containing toxic debris early on before toxic debris removal takes place where structures were lost. Sometimes straw mulching and straw wattles can be helpful on sites that have toxic debris. There's also special stormwater filter socks that provide more filtration of toxic debris as well. Soil, and we talked about soil and slope protection, but monitoring and maintenance is going to be really important. Repair and damages from the firefighting effort, as I mentioned, you can see this is a water bar almost going up and down the slope, very loose soils. I would remove something like this immediately. This is not going to unnecessarily cause erosion. Lop and scatter is a way to deal with fire breaks with the material that was removed for the fire break. This is emergency practices that you need to use extreme caution with or not use at all. This is all the wrong things to do on a slope. And lastly, in summary, this is my top 10 list. 10, get help. Licensed experts, RCD, NRCS. Respect the laws of nature. When you control water, you control nature. So be very careful about diverting and concentrating water on the post-fire landscape. Note that one size does not fit all. So don't do what your neighbors do. They might be doing the wrong thing anyway. And early on in the process, folks start copying each other and we keep copying the wrong thing on the landscape. Every property is unique, has a different set of variables. Minimize those slope and soil protections. There's no urgency to remove plants in trees unless they create an imminent hazard to life and high value property. Work and look beyond your property lines, work with nature, just like fire, erosion, and runoff doesn't respect these property lines. So we need to look at the bigger picture. You need to protect property access. Emergency measures are high risk and oftentimes only provide a false sense of security. And practices need maintenance. Just recognize that everything is undersized after fire, culverts and drains and what have you. Doing nothing or less may be best. Consider nature as your best management practice. And there's no silver bullet. When it's not safe, it's not safe. It's important to have an emergency plan and more than one exit plan, including one of those exit plans being on foot if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. You packed a lot of great information into that, and a lot of questions did come in, but in the interest of staying on our agenda, I think I might hold them to the end.
Sure.
I hope you'll be able to stay and
Yes.
join us for that.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you, Rich.
You're welcome.
And I think we'll move to the next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rich. Yeah, some of the questions that did come up, I think they will be addressed during some of the other sessions. And those that are not addressed, as Wendy said, we'll address them at the end. All right, so next up, we have Michael Jones. And Michael is Michael's gonna talk about the impact of fire on oak woodlands. And this might address some of the questions that that have come up. And Michael is a UC Cooperative Extension Forestry Advisor. He covers Lake, Mendocino, and Sonoma counties. And Michael has had, given all the fires we've had in recent years, has had the opportunity to conduct a fair amount of research on fire impacts. So Michael.
All right, thanks, Morgan. Thank you, everyone, for having me this morning. So I'll be talking about post-fire oak survival and regeneration, and mentioning a case study in which I'm following recovery of oak woodlands that were affected by the river fire that was part of the Mendocino Complex fire in 2018. So I just want to reiterate some of the things that Rich said, and I think it's really important to kind of make this clear, is that we live in a fire-adapted ecosystem. We, for the most part, most of California's natural landscapes are in Mediterranean climate zone, meaning we have hot, dry summers with lots of natural fire start events through dry lightning storms. And so fire is a common disturbance, maybe even more common by Native American management for thousands of years. And so that has shaped how our flora and fauna have adapted, and in particular, the oaks. So it's important to remember that. I know sometimes our first inclinations after these events is kind of to see what happens on the landscape and to be kind of, really concerned about what's happened to the trees and to the vegetation. But for the most part, if like Rich said, you leave it alone and it'll regenerate on its own. So well, I'll be talking about oaks, and I want to talk about kind of two really awesome life history strategies that oaks have that really help them recover from these types of disturbances from fire. So the first one is, fire tolerance. And really what that means is that, think about these oak species with really thick bark. So let's say blue oak, black oak, coast live oak is an example. And really what that means is essentially the tree can tolerate physical damage, the tree actually burning, catching on fire and burning. So you see in this photo on the top left, we have large blue oaks, and there's some evidence of fire damage on the stem. When you hack the bark off, you see that the outer inch or so of the bark has been killed by the fire, by the actual heat of the fire. But below that, where the black line is, that's healthy bark, and more critically, the healthy woody tissue beneath that. So the trees have evolved an ability to actually tolerate physical damage from fire. The other life strategy that's pretty cool, and remember, these are kind of broad groupings and characterizations of oak fire adapted strategies. The other one is called fire embracing, which I think is a really neat way of thinking about it. And so think of these as your oaks with thin bark. So your interior live oaks, scrub oaks, the species that have relatively thin bark when you think about the difference between coast live oak and interior live oak. And essentially what the strategy here for these species is on the top left. On the right side, you see that the fire damage was clear through the wood. And essentially the tree, if I'm going to anthropomorphize the tree, basically the tree is saying, hey, look, instead of investing a lot of resources in trying to survive a fire event or tolerate a fire event, I'm just kind of essentially going to let the fire kill my above ground biomass. And then quickly on the photo on the right, you see regenerate new tissue. And so it's really important distinction to think about the above ground biomass portion of an oak tree and the below ground biomass portion. And so fire events can, and I'll explore this more in a little bit, but fire events can kill the above ground biomass, but not necessarily result in a dead tree. And so we see quick regeneration of these species following fire. And quick, I mean within a month, if not less. And so basically you can kind of experience stands with these types of species or high severity fire events. You have this mortality that appears the trees are dead, but they regenerate through resprout. And it's even though we have kind of these general groupings of fire embracing, fire tolerance, all oak species resprout, showing that they can tolerate different types of fire severity or fire intensity. And so it's really important to remember that, because when we think of wildland fire, the fire impact is highly variable across the landscape. So on the left side, we have a landscape that had what we would call low severity fire, and fire severity is essentially the measure or the quantification of the physical damage or the ecological impact of the fire. Different from fire intensity, which is the actual kind of quantification of the chemistry or the physics of the fire itself. And so here we're looking at the ecological impact, the damage that the fire did to the trees. On the left side, you see that we would call that low severity, lots of charring on the bark, right? A little bit of bark consumption, but for the most part, the trees survive and they're all alive. And these are your fire tolerant species. And even some of your fire embracing species can do really well in low severity fires. In the middle, we have moderate severity fires. This is where you have the transition where your fire tolerant species are probably more likely to survive. There's a higher amount of charring and consumption of the bark tissues. Now you get some higher flame into the canopy, so maybe you're scorching some of the foliar tissue. As we're on the very right, we have a high severity fire stand. And this is essentially an event where even if your strategy is, or the oak tree strategy is tolerance, the fire severity is high enough that maybe you're having a standard replacement event and all of your oak species are resprouting under these conditions. So how do we assess fire damage? How do we kind of look at a stand and determine the fire severity or what happened in the stand? Really, the most important indication is the survival of the cambium. So the cambium is this really critically important layer of tissue that occurs right under the bark and sits on top of the woody tissue. And this is where this is the most active living portion of the stem. This is where all cell division occurs, nutrients transportation occurs. And so this is the critical layer of tissue that will determine whether the above ground biomass of the tree will survive. And so in these photos on the bottom right, what we have on the left is, again, we see that the outer portion of the bark is killed, but the cambium, which is this white tissue at the center, has a healthy creamy color. It means it's still alive. And so there's a very good chance that even if only 10% of the circumference of that stem is still alive and has this kind of tissue, there's a very high chance that that tree will survive, even if it has diminished kind of aesthetic qualities or it kind of struggles, but it will survive. Whereas this on the right, this is dead cambium, right? We saw this photo earlier, but this is where the tissue was killed by the heat. Either the heat was sitting on the bark and it kind of heated up and killed the cambium, or they actually burned the cambium tissue itself. And so you see this kind of damage on your tree, and you see the majority of a tree expressing this kind of damage. It's less likely to survive. The above ground biomass is less likely to survive. And you know, the best way to determine the survival of the cambium is to hack the bark off, but sometimes you can get a good indication of the impact of the fire to the tree just by observing the condition of the bark. So here again, kind of grouped into these fire severities, low to high. On the left, we have a low severity fire event, where you can see that there is charring on the bark, but the structure and kind of the pattern of the bark is still obvious, which means that likely that cambial tissue is still alive and the tree is probably relatively had a relatively good chance of survival. The middle to moderate severity, you have more bark consumption, so there's more fire on the bark, more of the bark was consumed. You see cracking in the bark, that really indicates that there's probably some cambium damage, but not necessarily a lot, or that it's persistent. On the right, we have high severity fire. Here, it's pretty obvious. You see that the wood is exposed on kind of the sunnier side of that tree and was actually burned. So this is a really good indication. Lots of cracking, lots of bark consumption. The wood is exposed. It's a very good indication of that tree. The above ground biomass of that tree will probably die. All right, so that's kind of how we kind of, well, I say we, but I myself and as we're assessing woodlands, it's kind of the first signs we look at to determine the condition of the stand and how the fire impacted the trees. I don't have photos, but I will say that looking at the canopy and the scorch, we call it, is not a good indication of survival. Foliar tissue is expendable, right? We have deciduous oaks, and even with evergreen oaks, they regenerate the foliage. And so the oak trees can tolerate damage to the canopy, to the foliage, and actually have shock or browning of the foliage from heat or flame damage, or they can even be burned. But as long as the woody tissue on the stems and the branches and the twigs is still alive, that foliage will regenerate. So looking at, you know, it's not attractive, but you see your browned out oak tree on the landscape, that doesn't mean the tree's dead. That just means following a fire event, that just means the canopy was affected. And it's very, very likely that if the fire occurs early enough this season, it might even start regenerating new leaves that season, or the next spring, you'll see a whole new flush of foliage from unaffected areas. So I want to talk about a case study just to show you how this kind of plays out in time, how the oak woodlands recover through time following these fire events. So the study I'm talking about, as I mentioned, was the 2008 river fire, part of the Mendocino complex. It was ultimately, I think, around 70,000 acres. But in the first 32 hours, it burned. It started on July 27th, and by the end of July 28th, it was around 10,000 acres. And so it burned through the Hopland Research and Extension Center, which is a research campus, part of the UC system, and it burned about 3,400 acres of the center. And just to kind of give you a sense of the fire behavior, it was wind-driven and a pretty, for the most part, fast-moving fire. I did the calculations at 10,000 acres within 32 hours. We're looking at about 300 acres per hour that it was a rate of expansion. So that's frankly, that's a pretty intense fire. Based on the growth of the LNU fire, that's pretty similar to the kind of conditions that we were experiencing with these fires. All right, so I would like to think that maybe these fires have had relatively similar impacts on the landscape. So the fire was burning through rangeland, oak woodland, chaparral, very similar conditions to what we're experiencing right now. And though there's a lot of variability in the fire history and the landscape and the LNU fire, at this particular research site, there's no record of fire. So within the last 100 years or so, there's been no fire, landscape level fire that occurred in this area, which I would suspect that a lot of areas in the LNU also have the same kind of fire history. So I collected data immediately after the fire within a couple months. And my first impressions would be that about 41% of the oak trees that I surveyed were dead. They appeared dead. There's no green tissue. They were completely burned over like in this photo. They all had moderate to high burn severity damage. So remember, that means that there's extensive consumption of the bark. And when we look at the cambium, a lot of it has been damaged and killed. And the char height or the length was kind of an indication of either flame length or the flames actually traveling up, burning up the stem, was typically 60%, 7% of the tree height. So we're looking at pretty high flame lengths. And, as I said, it's not very reliable characteristic, but for the most part, these trees had pretty much completely scorched and canopies were kind of burned off. In comparison, living trees, as kind of would be expected, had low severity charring, so very low percent or very low heights of flames carrying up on the stem. As you can see in the photo on the right, that right side of that tree is burned, but really most of the damage is on the moss that was on that tree. But there's still evidence of charring. The trees were still alive. They still had foliage that was green. And you see maybe in the larger landscape kind of panorama at the bottom, you see that some of the foliage was charred, but for the most part, the trees were alive. There's even still green moss on rocks in the understory. But what's really interesting, remember, this is only a few months after the fire, that 29% of the trees we classified as living had complete or near total above ground biomass mortality. Remember, I said that the above ground biomass can burn off, but the root structure can be still alive. And already within this short amount of time, we see this really incredible response of epicormic and basal sprouting. So epicormic sprouting is the kind of development and expansion of foliage occurring on the stem and in the branches. So not, foliage being produced in areas where you wouldn't expect it, right? So you're thinking maybe I would have leaves on the twigs and the buds, but when the trees are stressed, this is not just an oak thing, a lot of trees do this, hardwoods, they will produce photosynthetic tissue or leaves from the main stem or larger branches, kind of like a stress response. That if they've lost all of their leaves and they need to continue to produce sugars and accumulate nutrients, then they will do this kind of emergency development of photosynthetic tissue. And so it's a really kind of good indication of how stressed a tree is. So, but it's also a sign the tree is not completely dead yet. And then we have our basal sprouts, which are more kind of common sense in that, all of a sudden your tree looks dead, but there's green sprouts coming out from the base, which is a really awesome response to see in these stands. So pretty much rapid fire, 30%, just under 30% of the trees that we're seeing were already starting to regenerate. So in 2019, we went back and we assessed our area, and this was, I was pretty impressed by this. Remember, it was 42% or so in 2018. Mortality, truly dead trees that had no regeneration of any type had dropped down to about 13%, which I thought was pretty spectacular. And of the living trees, 81% of those had what we would consider complete above ground biomass mortality, and were aggressively producing basal sprouts. So remember, oaks will kind of, as you can see in these photos, will produce multiple stems, and I was pretty impressed with the rate of growth. So immediately after the fire, the handful of trees that we did see that had sprouts, they were maybe 6 inches, if that high, maybe a couple inches. A year following, they're already 2 feet high. I haven't come back in 2020 this year to reassess those plots, but I have been out to the site. And I would say for the most part, on average, basal sprouts have reached about 6 feet high. So the regenerative ability of these trees, even in areas that had pretty significant impact, is pretty impressive. As expected, 100% ground cover regeneration, the herbaceous and shrubby species do exceptionally well. And what's really great to see is that we're seeing natural regeneration. So not just sprouting, but we're seeing recruitment of oak seedlings. So this is really great to see some of the benefits of having fire in some of these systems. Insects and diseases are not a serious issue in oak woodlands, as is unlike in conifer stands where you have to be extremely concerned about bark beetles coming in and impacting your trees. For the most part, we only found evidence of insects and disease or insects on dead trees or the dead portions of trees. And we found some powdery mildew on California black oak sprouts, which is pretty common. I think the biggest issue was deer browse. So the deer aggressively hit the sprouts, particularly when the herbaceous species start to dry out and the sprouts are still green. They go after them really intensely. Fortunately, the trees just increase the rate of resprout, and so they just create, in this photo you see a really shrubby response, and so they kind of can compensate for a while on that browse. All right, so quickly considering management goals, as always, I like to say it depends on your goals and objectives. So what are you planning to do with your oak woodlands? So think about how you or the landowners you work with, what they want to do, and that's what should dictate what your next steps are. As always, it's important to consult a registered professional forester if you're doing anything forestry related. And if you want to assess your trees for risk or for health, you can contact consulting arborists. As Rich said, I concur. Initially, I would do nothing. In the oak woodlands, I think that's your best bet. They're highly fire adapted. They will respond and recover on their own. I think as little intervention as possible would be the best, at least initially. You do want to consider removing trees that could become hazardous. So those trees that could fall on structures or injure people, or that could block routes of access within your defensible space. And these typically can be large trees that have at least 50% of their stem with severe damage, or these smaller trees that typically are not as fire tolerant and have higher rates of damage. But when possible, leave trees that are dead above ground biomass, leave them standing. They provide really important protection for oak regeneration. They provide wildlife habitat. When they break down, they return nutrients into the system. They create complex structures and have lots of important ecological functions as the stands regenerate. If you are going to consider intervention or management, reassess after several growing seasons. So you want to let them recover for at least a year or more. And this is when you can come in and think about removing, if you have high value trees even falling, maybe this is now that you have a pretty good sense of how they're going to respond. Maybe this is when you start thinking about removing some of those trees or doing fields reduction work when you're concerned about managing for fire safety. If you have areas where there was a lot of high severity fire damage and there's no natural regeneration occurring, no basal sprouting or seedling recruitment, you can think about planting acorns. You have to be they're finicky, so you have to be a little bit conscientious of how you do this. And then you're gonna have to protect them from herbivory, because they will get eaten if they're not protected, particularly if you have lots of wildlife issues. And then this is the time you can also think about pruning basal sprouts. So as I said, the trees will produce tons and tons of sprouts, and after a few years, for example, in my study, they're about 6 feet high. You can go in there and find the most vigorous resprouts and trim the rest out, and that way the tree will focus its resources in producing those stems, and you can replace the tree, the above ground biomass portion of the tree, quicker with the tree of your choice. All right, so that's all I have. Resources I recommend you check out for a deep dive into all things oaks. The website UC Oaks, if you just type that in your search bar, it should be the first thing that pops up. And it's a phenomenal website that we manage and has lots of resources. They have under the resources tab on the page just for talking about fire. And so there's lots of guidelines and recommendations for managing oak woodlands post-fire. And then as always, I mentioned you need to contact a registered professional forester if you are looking to manage these stands. Any type of forestry related issues, you need to work with a registered professional forester. All right, well, thank you. And I don't know if I have time for questions, but maybe later on we can do Q&A.
I'm going to throw one quick one at you, Mike. I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions that came in. One question was, is there anything that you can do to help the oaks regenerate? And kind of a related question, how much of the survival or regeneration really relies on the amount of rainfall that we get? Yeah, oh, good question. So no, I would say there's no
yeah, there's nothing you can do to help. The best thing you can do is to leave it alone. Let it regenerate naturally. Let it regenerate on its own, and you'll be pretty impressed with the response. And I think rain is important, but think about these trees have been exposed to some pretty extreme drought conditions over the last few years, and then they're getting hit by fire and they're still regenerating. So rain, like the seasonality of rain, is not as important as long-term precipitation patterns. And so, if the kind of inclination is to irrigate in these systems, definitely don't do that. Adding water to naturally grown adapted oaks can actually be pretty detrimental. So let them regenerate on their own, and they will respond the way they do. And if you have to reassess because there's a drought condition or something like that, then we can revisit that. I stopped sharing screen, but I think my contact info is posted in the content for the workshop. And feel free to reach out if you or your landowners, if you're working with landowners, have questions. I'll be more than happy to talk with you further about this, and even conduct site visits to kind of go out and assess the initial kind of conditions and management recommendations.
Thanks so much, Mike. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
And
Thank
we'll
you.
move on to our next speaker. Thank you.
All right.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. All right, so next presentation is on the impacts of fire on rangelands. So I'm going to give part of this presentation along with Tanya Meyer from the Yolo County RCD and Chris Rose with the Solano RCD. All right, if I can have you advance to the next slide. So what to expect on rangelands? Well, we have different plant communities within our rangeland systems, and they are, as Mike and as Rich have been saying, they're generally very resilient to fire. It is a fire ecosystem, fire adapted ecosystem. And we'll probably see some short-term, medium-term, and long-term changes in the plant community. And it often coincides with the type of plant community we're looking at. So the herbaceous plant community will often see some short-term, within 1 to 3 year changes in the plant community. Chaparral, brushy areas, more of a medium-term change in the community, and woodlands will have perhaps some long-term changes in some areas depending on the fire severity. Next slide, please. So within the herbaceous plant community, changes that we'll see, one would be in the productivity. So basically the amount of biomass that's produced. And in the season, the next growing season, immediately following a fire, we typically see a 40% drop in rangeland productivity. The year after that, so it's the second growing season, we see about a 20% reduction in productivity and biomass production from what is typically normal. And then by the third growing season, we're back to pretty much normal production. Next slide. And the primary reason for that change is the impact that fire has on the species composition. So when fire passes through a grassland system, it really stimulates the germination of seeds, the broadleaf seeds. So plants like clovers, fillery, which you can see on the picture on the top right, fillery or erodium. Star thistle also gets very stimulated by fire, and a lot of native broadleaves. And then in that picture in the bottom right, you see vinegar weed is one of our native broadleaf plants. Tarweeds would be another one, and a lot of wildflowers as well would be stimulated by fire. So it's this abundance of growth, the stimulation of this germination of these broadleaf plants that really, it suppresses the grass species for that, especially in that first year. And the grass species eventually recover until it comes to what's maybe considered an equilibrium in that third year. Next slide. So it's awesome questions coming in the question and answer about impact of fire on weeds. And star thistle, medusa head, goat grass, those are the real common weeds that we have in our rangeland systems, at least in this part of the Northern California area. And really the fire, the LNU fire, many of these other fires is really the wrong time for obtaining weed control. The seeds have already fallen from the seed heads. They're on the ground surface. They're part of the seed bank. And when fire moves over through a rangeland system, the temperatures at the ground level really are not high enough to impact seeds in the seed bank, unless the fire intensity is really high and temperatures are high enough to affect those seeds in the seed bank. So yeah, fire will stimulate some weeds, especially plants like star thistle and other broadleaf plants. It also removes a lot of thatch that we see accumulate from some of these weedy plants. This does present a couple of opportunities. It is an opportunity to have more weeds because of this stimulation effect on broadleaf plants. So that could be one effect. It's also an opportunity to implement some weed control strategies, because if we have the stimulation of weed seeds, it's going to germinate a lot of seeds in the seed bank. And if a weed control strategy can be implemented the following spring, we can get pretty good control of the weeds. We extinguish a large part of the seed bank. So it does present an opportunity in that respect. Next slide, please. So what to expect in chaparral communities? Well, we see a lot of resprouting from the base, just as Michael is showing from the oak trees. The same is true for a lot of these chaparral species. And in this picture, the foreground is this is in Yolo County. The county fire in 2018 occurred. And the foreground was area that was, well, everything was burned in the county fire. The foreground didn't burn in the LNU fire. The background did burn in the LNU fire. You can see a lot of the shrubs are resprouting in that foreground area. So these shoots, they're often very highly palatable. They make good feed for wildlife, deer, livestock. They're highly palatable leaves. Many of them are. And this community does rebound pretty well. Control of the brush can be achieved with repeated burns or some other types of brush control if you want to try to convert that brushland into, say, grassland or another direction. Yeah, it does have to have some repeated control practices in order to achieve that, because it will, like I said, rebound or return to a chaparral community. Next slide. And Mike already said a lot about the oak woodlands. I don't need to say more, but just a lot really depends on the fire intensity. And you can see this is a area close to Pleasance Valley, where you see this really intense intense fire. This area was just completely vegetated before the fire. You couldn't even see through the canopy. And you see just a lot of white ash burned very hot in there. So there's probably going to be some tree mortality, but it looks like a very different landscape. Next slide, please. So other factors on rangelands, just infrastructure losses, pretty significant. In the foreground, you maybe can't see it, but close to the bottom of the picture, there's some field fencing that's on the ground. All the fence posts are gone. Corrals get burned. Watering systems often get burned. Plastic storage tanks, plastic piping, sometimes is lost in the fire. And also barns and other structures that are meant for either housing livestock or storing equipment and feed. So another big major impact on rangeland systems or graze systems. Next slide, please. So what to do? There's often a strong emotional desire to do something and something big because there's so much damage, and certainly understandable. But just my recommendation, I think that is in sync with that of others, to temper that with just the financial feasibility and the goals that you have for the landscape that you manage. And as people have been saying, seeding is often not necessary. If you are going to seed, do it for a good reason. Be sure that it's financially feasible and it meets your goals. And be strategic in where you do it. Do it for a good reason, maybe in areas that are high priority areas where there might be high aesthetic value or erosion potential, and maybe specific areas that you really do have to have forage for livestock that you have. And just look for those opportunities. One I mentioned is this could present an opportunity for some weed control. If star thistle has been a persistent problem, you're going to see a big flush of star thistle, and this might be a good opportunity to try to get the upper hand with some other weed control measures. And that in and of itself is a topic for another presentation. Tanya and Chris will say something about the reseeding, say some words about that, and I put up a resource in the chat about restoring annual grasslands. So next slide, I think, is for Tanya and Chris to take over.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Morgan. First of all, I want to say I'm sorry to everyone who lost property, especially your home. That actually happened to my family 5 years ago today. So I understand how you're feeling right now. So as other people have talked about, seeding is an option. You don't have to do it. I'm just going to quickly go through some slides in the event that you do want to seed. So next slide, please. So we kind of already talked about your management goals, reason to seed. Erosion control is a big topic, which will be covered later. You can improve forage and compete with some weeds with annual grass seed or native grass seed. Restoring the habitat for beauty and pollinator insects is great. Reasons not to seed, as has been mentioned before, the seed bank, which is seeds that are currently in the soil, are usually not affected by the fire. Even a high severity fire, you will often have seeds come up the next spring. Non-native seeds, which are less expensive, do outcompete beneficial native plants, so you don't want to seed for that reason. And seeding just changes the native plant community that's on your property. Next slide. If you do want to improve your forage and do a little bit of competing with the weeds in your rangeland, again, remember, burns don't significantly reduce the seed bank, especially in rangelands where they move through a lot quicker. They do remove thatch, which is, as Morgan said, a great opportunity. You could seed a non-native annual grass like annual ryegrass or soft chest or a forage mix to compete with your Medusa head and yellow star thistle. They're fast growing, but of course they won't outcompete the weeds that are there. They will outcompete the native plants, the native grasses that grow much slower. So again, avoid seeding those in native areas. And of course, the success of all this depends on your soil quality and the rainfall that happens this fall. Next slide. The fun part, at least for me, is wildlife habitat and ecosystem restoration. So native perennial grasses provide food and cover for wildlife. They have really deep soils or deep roots that stabilize the soil. You can add native wildflowers such as poppies or lupins. The native perennial grass seed is very slow to establish and the seed is expensive, so keep that in mind. And again, the success will depend on your soil quality and rainfall. Next slide. So as we talked about, don't overdo it. We want to do small areas. What we did on our property was really successful. So we got some rice straw, which, as Rich mentioned, it's mostly free of weed seed. Wheat straw is more expensive and can be more weedy, so you don't want to be introducing weeds onto your property. And our RCDs are looking at making some rice straw available for landowners. Next. So you can seed by hand, just sprinkle the seed out, and you want about 40 to 60 seeds per square foot. If you have little tiny seeds, they're a little bit harder to see as you spread them out. You can spread them by hand, or on the right you see a belly grinder, which is you can get at any hardware store. The seed is in and you just grind it and it spreads it out. Next slide. On a hillside especially, you can put some rice straw, a couple inches of rice straw over the top of the soil, just a couple inches. And if you can have a work party, it's a great way to feel better about what is going on your property. Next slide. So here's a before. You can see this was a really highly, it was a very hot fire on a brushy hillside. Next slide. And then in the spring, we were really lucky. We got some good gentle rains. There was some erosion, but not too much, but we have a great stand of native plants. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Tanya. I think a lot of the things have actually been covered and then more will be talked about, so I don't want to be too redundant. So I'd just like to say a few things. That one of the reasons rice straw is a good choice for upland seeding is that the weeds, if there are any weeds in the rice straw, they're going to be water-loving weeds because it's grown in an aquaculture type scenario. So if you're using a dryland straw such as oats or wheat, the chance of having upland or dryland weeds in them is a lot higher. So basically, so what I'm kind of taking from this is that the idea of doing something versus doing nothing, and it's going to depend on each site. And Morgan talked about, you know, what are your goals at the site, and essentially doing an evaluation of your spot as far as slope, looking for white ash spots that where there's an incredibly hot burn and maybe something wouldn't grow there. But so another idea is to combine some of these different ideas and just pick a few spots. I often have an all or nothing attitude when it comes to these sorts of things, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. You could take some endemic wildflower seeds or a mix, let's say lupins, a couple species of lupins and poppies and a few others, maybe yarrow, some annual and some perennial wildflower seed, and you can do a 500 square foot area around your place for aesthetic purposes and also for emotional reasons as far as just being able to have something that's beautiful and being able to act. And I often think we forget, what would I do in this situation? And I guess it's hard to sit and watch and wait. So it would be assessing what areas I could basically spread rice straw on, but also do very minimal groundwork and ground prep to certain areas and spread seed and then actually straw mulch those and watch what happens. It could be relatively inexpensive to do small areas around your place, and that would actually give you a test plot and would be informative for you into the future on your property as far as whether those species will persist. Historically, before fire became difficult and the monster that it seems like it has become in the last 10 or 15 years, we used to pre-burn a lot of our sites where we did seeding just so we could reduce thatch and also see what comes up and see what kind of weeds or other plants that come up. This is your opportunity, since it already happened, to do that evaluation and try some different methods on a small scale on your place. I think that's all I have. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Morgan, Tanya, and Chris for that great presentation. We are running just a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to hold questions to the end. Thank you, everyone. And we'll move on.
All right. And I just wanted to point out that the RCDs, the Yolo RCD, Solano RCD, Napa RCD, those are, and along with the USDA, all sister agencies, are excellent resources for information on those restoration efforts and what can be done, what should be done. All right, next up, we're going to shift gears a little bit, moving from more of the natural systems, ecosystems, to more managed ecosystems. And so we have Katherine Jarvis-Shean to talk about the impact of fire on orchard trees, which certainly did happen in the LNU fire. And Katherine is a UC Cooperative Extension Orchard Systems advisor, and she covers Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento counties. So there you go, Katherine. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Morgan. So let's talk about orchards. And, you know, a lot of this is functioning on the same principles that Mike talked about with the impact to oak trees. But when we're thinking about the impact to orchards, and, you know, this is if you have a production orchard, but this is also relevant for some of you guys who might have just some trees around your property for your own consumption. It matters to think about whether you're looking at damage of burn or heat damage. It matters to be looking at the damage in the canopy versus the trunk. So we'll talk a little about that. And then talk through what to expect in terms of the signs of damage, the timing of that damage, and the potential for recovery. And then what to do about it, which I think I would echo what lots of folks have already said is be patient. There's a lot of recovery that you might not expect that will manifest. I would say a little differently from the natural systems, getting some water on your trees now to be sure those roots aren't drying out, not too much, but just a little bit. And then if you are in a situation where you want to be replanting the whole orchard, we'll talk about some considerations for that. Okay, so thinking about the impact of fire to trees, heat versus burn, what you see on the left is heat damage of just the heat of that fire actually expands the water, boils the water such that it bursts the cells that that water is in. And then so those cells sort of fall apart and can never recover. So that tissue that got heated up cannot recover. Whereas you see on the left, that tree, actually the carbon in that tree combusted and burned. So these are sort of the two extremes of the manifestation of fire to wood or to the trees. And it matters as well where the fire has had the impact. If you're looking at up in the canopy versus down in the trunk, as you see here, you know, we need to remember that the trunk is really the conduit of all the water and nutrients to get up into that canopy. So if the trunk is quite damaged, no amount of, you know, that canopy is not going to recover. Whereas if you just have damage up in the canopy, you can cut that back for sanitation reasons so it doesn't get more diseases spreading around there. And then we can move nutrients, the tree can move nutrients and water up to support future growth. So in terms of what to expect, you know, it's a really broad spectrum, as I said, whether you're on the far left here of those leaves being scorched, but the wood still being viable, or the far right here of the whole tree having burned to the ground. And there's a lot of things that we can see in between. So if heat was sort of approaching the structure of the tree, the trunk, the canopy, we can have boiled sap, which will manifest as this bleeding, which you see here, if you can see my cursor. And that's really the sap is boiled and it's burst out of the sugar pipes, the phloem. Or as we sort of move up the spectrum of damage, we can get that deep heat damage that Mike was talking about with oaks. So we have a couple of layers of cells here that matter to us. We have on the outside our sugar pipes, which circulate energy around the tree. And then we have the cambium layer, which Mike was talking about. And that is what makes cells for future years. So when that's damaged, that means the tree can't make cells in the future, can't make sugar and water pipes in the future. And then on the inside of that, of those sort of stem cells, that cambium, we have the water pipes, which conduct water all around. So we can see that damage might be go all the way in to damage the cambium, but only on part of the tree. You might see that damage, that heat damage, get all the way around to really girdle the tree in essence. And obviously you can't go through each tree and cut it off of the trunk to see how damaged it is, because then what if it looks like this on the left? Well, you already cut the tree down, so it's not going to recover. So, so you'll want to be cutting into the bark to try to assess this. And what you see sort of down here on more close to the bottom On younger trees or thinner barked trees, just taking a knife and cutting away, you'll be able to differentiate. This is irrecuperable tissue on the right, this brown here, and healthy green tissue on the left. As Mike said, you know, with walnuts, which a lot are a lot of the damaged trees that I saw in Pleasance Valley, at least. It can be tough to know what's old dead bark and what is dead future tissue. So I'd recommend finding like a really intensely damaged tree and look for that difference here. You'll find a healthy zone and an unhealthy zone. And so that's the sort of damage you'll see. But I want to emphasize that the timing of this damage, it can take many months to really fully see the damage, for the damage itself to fully manifest. So in terms of any action that you would take, really the best way to do this is wait until spring to see what grows and see what doesn't. Think about this if you've dealt with freeze damage in the past. It's a really similar approach, and it's actually within the tree. It's a very similar problem. The freezing expands the water to burst that cell, destroying the cell, and the boiling of the water also bursts the cell to destroy that cell. So the tree is actually dealing with this damage in a very similar way to freeze damage, and we should as well. You know, so waiting until spring, because the tree can surprise you both ways. Sometimes that xylem, which is, you know, a couple layers in, can keep conducting water up to keep leaves alive. And so it might look like the tree is going to make it, but without that cambium to make water pipes for the following year, it's not going to make it next year. On the other hand, the tree might surprise you in a good way with these adventitious buds, or what Mike referred to as epicormic shoots. So these are buds that are sort of buried in the wood and can really sprout back in an aggressive way. So I would say wait at least a month until normal leaf out timing. What you see here on the right is these two pictures. This is after freeze damage in the spring of 2019. So the freeze itself was November of 2018. This is in Chandler, which usually leaves out in mid-April. And you see here in the foreground a couple of trees that look really rough. And when other trees are already leafing out, it'd be easy to give up hope on these trees, but you wait another month and you see a lot of adventitious growth that's taken off. And so, you know, you would end up pruning a lot less of this tree, having waited to see what can really work out. So in terms of assessing the damage, I would say first and foremost, take lots of pictures because things will change dynamically. You can get, if you have a smartphone, you can get a timestamp app. So that'll put just the date on top of any picture that you take, the way that it used to work with normal film cameras. Start a file with your FSA tree assistance program. I know they're going to talk about, FSA is going to talk later in the program, but in the first 90 days, you need to at least start a file, even if you don't put in a full report about damage until the following spring. And if you do have a crop out there, so like walnut and olive folks, some of you still have some crop that you might want to harvest. So just make sure that you're sorting that out. You're flagging those trees that were damaged versus what aren't, especially if you have a custom guy who's going to come in and be doing that for you. If you feel like there's enough orchard to save, getting a little bit of irrigation out there in these sort of short, frequent sets, making sure you're adjusting for there's not nearly as much transpiring of leaves. So they don't need nearly as much water as they used to get, but they do need a little water to keep that root zone moist so those roots don't dry out, so they're not even more stressed than they already are. You've also likely lost a lot of the canopy cover in terms of the leaves. So especially on young trees, I'd say up to third, fourth, or even fifth leaf, going in with some whitewash to prevent sunburn. So we're only in early September now. We still have at least a month of potentially hot conditions if the skies ever clear out of smoke. So that can prevent future damage. And again, think about this like freeze damage. Wait at least a month until after a leaf out to really do your full assessment of the damage and to go in with any serious pruning. This is just a sort of different way to look at this process if you're more of a flowchart person, not a picture-driven person. So thinking first about the trunk damage, because that's really, if you can't get water up through the trunk and nutrients up through the trunk, it doesn't matter what the canopy looks like. So if that trunk is severely burned or heat damaged, seeing bleeding, boils, dead layers under the bark, or suckering, actually, as Mike was also saying, that's kind of an indication if you get growth near the base of the trunk, that the trunk itself is so damaged that the tree can't get nutrients up and it's sort of diverting those nutrients into new growth at the bottom. If more than 50% of that trunk shows dead tissue below the bark, that tree is probably not going to fully recover. And recovery will be uneven and slow and never quite as productive as in the past. So keep that in mind as you're thinking through this damage assessment. If your trunk is in good shape, then we can start thinking about the canopy condition, whether we have burn or heat damage up in the canopy. If so, we're changing our irrigation up. We're treating this like freeze damage, not pruning until about a month after a leaf out, and thinking about whitewashing the trunk, the primary scaffolds, and the secondary scaffolds. And that whitewashing is just a mix of 50% white house paint and water, 50% water like you would have done at planting. And even if things look okay, keep monitoring. It can take some time for this damage to manifest. Okay, and then what to do when you've kind of done your assessment. You're going to get to the point where you're thinking, do I remove this whole orchard? Do I replant some trees? Or do I try to rehabilitate some trees? And especially if you're in the replant, there will probably be a mix of replant and rehab. So thinking through how much of the orchard is damaged, if that damage is mixed or in zones, how much replumbing is necessary if there's been a lot of damage to your irrigation system, the productivity of that orchard prior to the fire. So, was that orchard sort of on its last leg? Did it have a lot of, say, crown gall or nematode damage, deep bark canker, things that are already going to be stressing those trees out that will make it hard for them to recover if you were to do a heavy prune on them. But especially I would say in middle-aged trees, if they were healthy going into the fire, dehorning them, so severe pruning them back to the secondary scaffolds to cut out damaged tissue is probably going to refill that space faster than a replanted tree. So keep that in mind. You sort of have to balance, was the tree healthy enough beforehand to recuperate from this stress, or was it sort of on its last leg already? If you're seeing mixed damage or and you want to replant some of those trees, I will say that those replants will have a real struggle if they're surrounded by more vigorous, large, healthy trees that will shade them out. You'll also really be combating, do I water just enough for this little tree so I don't drown it? Do I water enough for this large tree so it meets its needs? And you're never really gonna be treating either of them the way that's best for them. So that mixed damage, I think, is more in the column of removing the orchard and restarting. But much more what I've seen is this sort of damage on the roadside, damage on the margins, like in the bottom photo you see here. And that's if those trees need to be pulled out, it's much easier to get new trees growing in that zone because watering them is easier, they'll get more sunlight, etc. If you do decide to pull out your whole orchard, it's important to know that, as we've said about the seed bed, also this fire was hot enough to kill the tree, but might not have been hot enough to kill the pests and diseases in the root zone. So think about this like you'd be ripping out an old orchard. There might still be roots that are viable, that are harboring soil pests or diseases. So if you can, go after all those roots when you're pulling them out. Think about fumigating perhaps, at least testing for nematodes if you're down near the creek zone in the flat of any valley. Think about trying to put in a new crop, or at least changing your root stock to change the genetics up a little bit and give those trees a fighting chance. And that's it. This is my email address. If you have any follow-up questions, I think we might have a little time for questions now.
I'm going to throw one out there for you, Katherine. So you had mentioned irrigation as an important step to try to keep roots alive, but a lot of folks had their irrigation systems and their wells burn. Do you have any suggestions for ways to get water on those trees when the systems are down?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. I would say, these trees aren't transpiring a lot, so it doesn't need to be a lot of water. If you can get a water truck out there, really even just one dose between now and when we get rainfall will be a lot more helpful than leaving them high and dry. You can put some sort of dig out a moat around and fill it up to make sure you can get a fair amount of water in one pass if you have a truck come out with water. Pole hoses, yeah, you kind of have to get creative.
All right, thanks. Yeah, we're struggling with a lot of issues here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katherine. And we'll follow up with some more questions at the end because I think it is time for our bio break. I'll pass it over to Morgan.
Yes, it is. We are ready for our bio break. There are some poll questions that, and thank you guys for responding to the polls. It's going to be very helpful for us in looking at future workshops and seeing the best way to meet your needs. There were some poll questions that were not put up after some of the sessions because we just did not have time for some question and answers. So maybe during this 5-minute bio break period, we could put those up, and if you all can answer them. So it's 10:47 right now. So how about we just stick to our 5-minute break, and we'll come back at 10:52, and then we'll be pretty close to being on time. All right, thank you. All right, well, it's 10:52. I think we got those some of those logistics squared away. Thanks for answering the poll questions during the break. So we will continue on, and next up we have a presentation by Glenn McGourty on the impact of fire on vineyards and wine grapes. And Glenn is a UC Cooperative Extension Viticulture Advisor Emeritus. So recently retired, but never fully retired. And Glenn has, in his career as a viticulture advisor, has covered Lake and Mendocino counties. So Glenn, thank you for making yourself available and coming out of retirement for this.
Sure, you bet, Morgan. Well, hello, everybody. So today's talk, we're going to talk about fire damage itself. What happens when a live fire goes in the vineyard, or you get heat from scorching winds, which can go in quite a ways depending on the fire event. Then we're going to talk about harvest following smoke. This is really a serious issue for the industry, especially this year. And what we want to know is the fruit smoke damaged? How do we minimize smoke flavors for white wines and for red wines? Next slide. So fire damage in the vineyards is when you get a live fire in. And the good news is that typically vineyards don't burn that easy unless you really have a hot day with a lot of wind. We find that small vineyards with brushy borders are the most at risk. And if you have dry cover crops or weeds, they're going to make it worse. So my advice to someone who's kind of in fire country is make sure that you mow really short or even clean cultivation in some instances if erosion is not going to be a problem. The damage you're going to get depends on the speed of the fire and the wind. So the hotter The more wind, the more damage you get. We find often that fire will travel into the vineyard through a riparian area. If you have a little creek or something, or any brush that's in there, that's where it's likely to go. Next slide. So these vines are basically dead. I mean, they've been cooked. You can see that the drip tubing is melted. You had a live fire that got right into the vineyard, and it really smoked these vines. Next slide. Okay, so the fire went through quickly. In this case, the vines probably are okay because it was a fairly low going fire. It was very windy that day, but the fruit's probably no good. Next slide. So what we see when vines are damaged, I think that actually Kat talked about this, it's very similar to trees. It's usually seen on the margins of the vineyards. And when we have a vineyard firestorm that blows through the area with very hot winds, the vines may recover, but still have damage to the vascular system. So they might look like they're okay initially, but then later on, they just don't do very well. And like trees, it may take some time to see the damage. So we really want to do an inspection of the vine, see if the trunk and cordon vascular systems are okay. And if not, you might be able to rejuvenate it by heavy pruning right down to the graft unit if the tissue there is healthy. It just depends, but usually once you have a compromised vine, you're in trouble. Next slide. So here's an example of where very, very hot winds and a low burning fire. You can see the vines are pushing at the tips, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to survive. It's a good sign if you see green growth, but you really have to wait until next year to be sure. And we usually do inspection of the vascular system too to find out what's going on. Next slide. So close inspection, cut into the vascular system in multiple places and see if the tissue is still green and turgid, meaning does it look healthy to you? You may need a hand lens or microscope, but look for grayish discoloration or browning of the vascular tissue. Cut into buds on shoots to see if they're green, and if things look okay, re-inspect the following spring. So as far as re-irrigation goes and stuff, you don't necessarily want to push a lot of growth at the end of the season, but if things are really dry, I would do some irrigation because you could also end up with frost or freezing damage in the winter as well if things are really dry. Next slide. Kat said something really wise, which is basically you can't tell a lot of difference sometimes between freeze damage and heat damage, and this actually is from the Lake Erie region showing frost damage on vascular tissues, and looks very similar. On the right, you have a healthy looking wood, and on the left, you have dead wood. And in between, you have gradations. And if you look at sample D, you can see streaking in the vascular system. That's usually an indication that you've got problems. Next slide. So that's basically vineyards. You can do an assessment fairly quickly. As I said, it's usually the margins around a vineyard that have problems, and same thing applies as Kat said with trees. You can apply to FSA for maybe replant money. But now we're going to talk about smoke, since we seem to have lots of it these days. So smoke can travel hundreds of miles, but usually settles near the fire in low areas when the wind isn't blowing. There's various components. There's visible airborne products of combustion, including tar, ash, carbon, and partially burned fuel fragments. But probably more damaging to us in the vineyard industry are these many gases that are coming off of a fresh fire. And you can see we have everything from carbon dioxide to ammonia and methane and carbon monoxide. The particulates themselves only make up about 1.5 to 2% of the material that's burned. Next slide. So what are your risks for smoke damage? Fresh smoke is really what you're worried about. So when smoke inundates your vineyard near a rapidly burning fire accompanied with considerable heat, as when it's blown into or rises through your vineyard, such as when you're on a hillside and the fire is below, that's when you're going to have problems. Old smoke, like we're getting from some distance, and in our case, we're getting a lot of smoke right now out of Mendocino National Forest, and it's 30 or 40 miles away. And it makes our lives miserable, but it probably won't affect the fruit. It's the fresh smoke that's the problem because it's got all the volatile gases. Old smoke is mostly suspended particulates. Next slide. I've had personal experience with this. This happened right across the street from where we were in 2018, and at that time, that was the largest fire in California. Since that time, we're just eclipsing that. amazingly this year. Next slide. These are satellite images, and July 28th on the left, you can see where the fire is starting. And then August 4th, you can see where it's burning. And I actually did a research study with Mike Jones and some other people to take a look at the impacts of smoke to try to figure out which vineyards got smoked and which ones didn't. The little red spots you see are actually actively burning fires. Next slide. So just to explain this, here we see vineyards burning, and on the picture on the left, there's smoke that's kind of headed for this vineyard, and the fire is headed for this vineyard. It's probably going to have some severe damage. The picture on the right, you can see where the smoke is blowing through. We've got pretty good wind, and there's actually a vineyard in that area, and the cloud kind of in the upper left-hand portion of the screen. And that vineyard certainly is going to have smoke damage. On the other hand, the vineyard down below, if the wind direction doesn't change and it doesn't burn so there's blowing smoke across it, it might be perfectly okay. Next slide. So what happens? Well, lignan's the source of the phenolic compounds, and that makes up about 20 to 30% of the mass of a tree. And lignin primarily lines the vascular systems. There's two compounds that we watch really closely. It's guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol. They're volatile phenols associated with smoke flavors in food. They also are in toasted oak barrels. It's a good indicator for smoke damage, and we have rapid commercial lab analysis most of the time. This year, there's so many samples, the labs are simply inundated. They can't respond quick enough. What we need to understand is that guaiacol is not the only compound involved. There's about 70 other phenolic compounds that have off flavors and described as licking an ashtray, burnt garbage, burnt potato, campfire drenched with water. That's not so good. Guaiacol is associated with bacon, and if all smoked wine tasted like bacon, it would probably sell more of it, but it doesn't. It gets into some of the other flavors, and that's where we have a problem. Next slide. So as you can see in the top, we have a fire, the grapes are ripening, and we end up with smoke flavors in the bottle. And why is this? Because there's the grapevine has enzymes in it that normally what it does is it's catching an antioxidant called resveratrol, which some of you may have heard of before. And it's a naturally occurring compound in the grape that has a benzene ring and a hydroxyl radical on it. And it binds it with sugar, and that helps the plant get through harvest without any mold or bacteria issues. So to the vine, it sees all of these smoke compounds as looking very similar, and it binds them in there, and then we end up with smoke problems. Next slide. And there's the structure of guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol. They look a lot like resveratrol. Next slide. So where are these smoke flavored compounds in the grapes? Well, they accumulate in the skins rather than the pulp and the juice. So that's the key. The skins are where you're going to find them. So we test the fruit before picking to see if those smoke compounds are there. And if we find anything more than about 0.5 part per billion guaiacol, you might have smoke problems. Guaiacol may not be giving the bad flavor, but it's highly correlated with all the other volatile phenols that are likely to get in there that cause the off flavors. And if we get fruit with more than 5 parts per billion guaiacol, it's not worth picking. And wineries just simply can't make good wine out of it because it's going to taste bad. Next slide. So if you're going to check your vineyard after smoke damage, berry sampling is a good way to do it if you can get it to a lab. So we'd pick about 1 pound of fruit, we place it in a plastic Ziploc bag and keep it cool, and bring it to a lab that's capable of analyzing guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol. The results are normally in 1 to 2 days, but there's so much smoke going on this year, it's more like about 6 or 7 weeks. It's expensive. It's about $150 to $250 per sample, but it's definite. Next slide. So the other thing you can do is make microfermentations, is basically small batches of wine. You can go anywhere from 1 quart to 5 gallons. You take a representative sample from the block you're checking. It's 7 to 10 days to ferment. It's very affordable, and it's good for testing multiple blocks. Then you can taste the wine itself and have it analyzed for guaiacol and figure out if you're smoke tainted or not. It's very obvious. It's a really good way to go if you have the time. So in the case of Lake County Fire, we had the fire in August and early September. We didn't harvest till late September, so it gave us plenty of time to check to see if there were issues with the individual blocks. Next slide. There's a very high correlation between what we find in the berries and what we find in wine. Basically, when yeast uncouples these various phenolic compounds, the smoke taint quality goes up. So what we see here is that there's a correlation between the wine guaiacol and the berry guaiacol with an R-squared of 0.98, which is extraordinarily so it's very predictive. So if we know that we're getting a real good coefficient of oh boy, I'm kind of stumbling here a little bit. Anyway, it's highly correlated, and we know that it's a good number, so we can predict very accurately what we're finding in grapes versus what's going to be in wine. It basically increases 4 to 6-fold. Next slide. So we actually did some work in Lake County where we went through some vineyards that were exposed to smoke. Some wineries were saying it's all destroyed, and we didn't believe it, so we went out and did a test of about 14 different vineyards, and then we made micro lots of wine and we tested them. We gave them a rating of 1 to 5, with 1 meaning we don't really detect anything, 3 is something was wrong, and 5 is awful. Next slide. Here we are set up for the tasting. So this is a blind tasting. We don't know what we're tasting exactly, but the wine looks perfectly good. It doesn't always smell good. Next slide. So here's a picture on the left is the fire when it was going on, looking down from outer space, and then on the right, the blue dots are where we sampled the vineyards, and you might notice that the vineyards that were most affected by smoke is the ones that are closest to the red outline, and that's where the actual fires were. So again, if you're in the path of smoke that's blowing through your vineyard that's fresh, you're probably going to have issues. Next slide. Here's how when we plotted them out, this is what they looked like in terms of the mean taste testing is the axis on the left, and on the bottom is the guaiacol content, ranging from barely detectable up to almost 35. Next slide. So what we found is that when we're below about 10 parts per billion in the wine, we really couldn't clearly discern the smoke taint. So low amounts of this compound are probably not a big issue. But as soon as we get above 10, next slide, then we're able to figure out something was wrong. And so we figured the likely taint threshold for most people is around 10 parts per billion. We're very sensitive to these smoke flavors. We can pick them out really well in our mouth. Next slide. So what do we do with the white fruit? Well, if we can, and the guaiacol levels are fairly low, if they're like under a part per billion, if we harvest when it's cool and we try to avoid breaking the skins, hand harvesting would be good. We separate the pressed fraction from the free juice when we're doing the pressing. So the harder you squeeze, the more you're going to get the bad stuff out. We'll take that pressed fraction and treat it with ultrafiltration or other techniques, and we can get the phenolics and discoloration out. We can blend it back, and then we can very effectively treat it. And so white wines, we have a little bit of an opportunity to fix because we don't have so much skin contact, and we just don't have as many phenolic compounds in the wine compared to red. Next slide. So red fruit's more of a problem because we have to have contact with skin to get the color out, and we find that our guaiacol levels are going to go way, way up. And you definitely don't want to put it in toasted oak barrels, since that also contains guaiacol. It just makes it worse. Next slide. So how do they fix it? Well, they try reverse osmosis, but the problem with that is you're taking out other phenolics, so you tend to dilute the overall flavor of the wine, so it gets kind of more and more feeble. Some wineries just take a big loss and sell it in the bulk market for blending into a very big tank. And now wineries prefer not taking smoke-affected fruit. It's just too difficult to deal with between the expensive treatment and then trying to move it into the marketplace. Next slide. So the human factor is not everyone perceives smoky flavors the same way. So some people are very affected by it, especially winemakers. They get sensitized to it, and they get really stressed whenever they get near it. So on the other hand, white wines, we can clean those up fairly effectively, but red wines are much more of a challenge to fix if seriously tainted. Next slide. So that basically is what I have to tell you. I would just say that this research continues, and my advice to any grape grower who lives in fire country is that they should get crop insurance and not be afraid to make a claim. And I think this year especially, wineries are just being very picky because we've got a pretty good supply of wine in the tank. So there's going to be a lot of fruit kind of left in the vineyard. And by the way, it's okay. You don't have to pick it. It won't hurt the vines. If you just leave it there, the birds will eventually eat it. And when you prune, it will finish it all up. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. There was one question, but I think you just answered it. The question was, if fruit is left unpicked, is there a benefit to future vine health in removing the fruit from the vine?
No need to. Don't spend the money.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Thank you for all that information. And we'll all be looking for the good deals on smoky wine this fall or next year.
All right. Thank you, Glenn.
Ready to move on.
Thank you. And if we can maybe just put up the poll, there we go. And while that is up, yeah, it's really interesting. Maybe in addition to the alcohol content on wine bottles, maybe we'll also see the glycol content as well. It might be useful. All right, so next up, we have a longer session on erosion risks and mitigation measures. We thought there would be more interest and perhaps questions on this particular topic. And so we dedicated, I believe it was 40 minutes to erosion. And we have two presenters on this. First, we have Nick Gallagher, and Nick is a rangeland specialist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in Yolo County. And also Bill Birmingham, who's a conservation project manager for the Napa Resource Conservation District. And Bill is also a certified professional in erosion and sediment control. So I think, Nick, you'll be going first and then handing off to Bill. So take it away.
All right, so I just want to focus on more of some of the key things and the critical focus areas from fire, especially on some of the larger rangeland areas, ranching properties. Some of these points can be good for small landowners as well. Next slide, please. So there's an overwhelming initial reaction to fire. Most people want to rush out and do a lot of work, and there's a lot of shock and devastation, and what should I do? And the picture on the left-hand side is a pretty severe burnt area. The picture on the right is more of a less severe fire. You can even see patches unburned. And so there'll be different reactions to these situations. Next slide, please. Okay, a lot of these have already been discussed. Just go over it real quickly again. Looking at the critical things. So the dozer lines, especially fire suppression efforts, those are the areas that are going to have some severe impacts and a lot of exposure. Focusing on important critical infrastructure such as drainage and culverts is going to be where you want to take a look at. And in large situations where there's lots of acreages, you really can't cover it all. And that whole do nothing concept that we've been talking about a lot really does apply. So, and it's very overwhelming. So focusing on just some minor things will be very helpful. Next slide, please. Okay, Rich covered a lot of these and so did other speakers. So I'm not gonna spend too much time, but again, the concepts are do not disturb soil, look and identify for drainage issues that you might potentially have, areas where you might be channeling water, could be a problematic, give fire affected vegetation time to recover. We heard that many times already. And just really allowing the natural recovery to happen. Actions you can take, clearing, protecting culverts, addressing drainage issues, especially looking at areas around structures or home sites or access roads that get you to and from a property. Next slide, please. So I'm going to point out a couple things that you can do, and what actually to focus on it. And really the answer is the critical areas. So the picture on the top right hand corner is a fire break that was put in through a creek, and it's a direct source of sediment to that creek. It might be something you would want to address potentially. Next slide, please. So the main thing here on these large ranch lands is to take a look at your existing infrastructure. That would be an area to focus on. So look at where your culverts are, look at your drainages that lead to roads, and identify the problems. This culvert on the right-hand side is effectively sedimented in. It can't flow water properly. So that would be something you would really want to take a look at, potentially take a shovel. Very quick, very easy, very practical to fix that problem. Next slide, please. So the red flags, the things to really look out for, again, those culverts. On the left-hand side, you'll see a culvert leading into a little small drainage, and there's a lot of woody debris that has fallen into that drainage. Just below that, on this right-hand side, is a pond, and that's a pond spillway. And you can already see that culvert in that spillway has started to fail. There's soil built up in that culvert. It's broken. And if you allow that drainage on the left-hand side to flow into this pond and carry a lot of woody vegetation, it could potentially jam up that culvert and then cause that pond to blow out. And then you would lose that water source and also cause some issues downstream. Next slide, please. Some other things to look out for is fire breaks. The photo on the right-hand side is a fire break. It's a straight run down a side slope. It's got a berm on the edge of the fire break that could potentially channel a loss of water, and it would definitely cause some erosion issues and some active heg fetting and potentially the loss of that road if allowed to go uncontrolled. So we have to be careful with water bars and things of that nature, but you can get some help with designing proper drainage systems off of roads. The left-hand side is an area where we had some channeling down a road. I believe that ditch is actually like a foot deep, so it looks more significant in person than on the picture. But we actually applied some water bars. You'll see the red lines there. Those were water bars we put in to stop that channeling on that road. Next slide, please. And then again, here's this is a fire line. This is the fire line. I think it's 3 dozer widths wide that went from Capay Valley down to the Winters and the 2018 fire. And this is an example of people coming back in and blending that berm in with the side slope there on the left-hand side of the screen, and just allowing the water to drain off properly and not get into any sort of concentrated flow. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm gonna show a demonstration project that we did. This is a before photo of a creek crossing that was also part of that 3 dozer wide fire break. We applied some fairly simple practices, a straw mulch and a contour straw wattle type practice. Next slide, please. So here's another before shot. You can see on the right-hand side that soil is very chewed up. It's very loose, very highly erodible. This project was a 40-foot wide by 400-foot long strip crossing this creek. The landowner wanted to protect it, so we went ahead and designed a little project to give it a try to see what we could do to help it. The bottom left-hand screen with the arrows, this is why it was a concern. You got drainage coming from the right-hand side. There's a road that comes from the top. From the left-hand side, a road that actually comes back down towards us in the photo, and then the runoff coming off of the side of the hill slope there. It all leads to where that black arrow is, which is where the man is standing in the bottom of the creek. So we saw a need to address that concentrated flow and then help protect the banks there, or the crossing there. Next slide, please. So here's the after view. What we did was, if you can look at the bottom left-hand screen, that's where we applied our wattles. And what we did, instead of buying very expensive materials, these are all materials that we had on site, that the landowner had on site. And it's more practical and cost effective. So we laid out flakes of hay, and then staked them down, and we staggered them. So there's actually 2 layers there. And we actually use those kind of as our wattles. And then we covered it all with the mulching on top of it, the whole entire site afterwards. And we effectively were able to actually control all the runoff. This project responded very well to the treatment. And with 4 people, it only took us 2 hours. It was 17 bales, $8 each, 100 wooden stakes, And total cost was only $310 to get this done. Next slide, please. And so one thing I wanted to point out is controlling runoff in the right location. So the blue line, that's our little flake wattle there we made up. On the left-hand side, it was unburned and it was a little swell and gentle slope. So we decided to try to direct water to that area where it could filter through vegetation. It wasn't steep. And I just wanted to point that out. Next slide, please. So here's some other actions you can do. Again, there's that halfway buried culvert and then a culvert with an exposed bank on the left side. I'll show you an example of somewhat of a velocity dissipation device. Next slide, please. And then one other thing to look out for, during firefighting activities, you have big trucks, you have equipment moving through. This rock ended up falling in front of that culvert. I don't know if it was because of firefighting or if it just happened to happen, but that could potentially jam up debris, sediment, and then cause that to wash out. So just taking a look out for those simple little things, just moving that rock out of the way, maybe clearing the exit of that culvert to try to prevent it from getting backed up. Next slide, please. So what we did on the right bottom screen is that culvert that was filled up with sediment. We dug it out and we tried to make a little channel. Hopefully it'll kind of clean itself out as the heavy rains come, or hopefully heavy rains, or not hopefully heavy rains in the beginning, but hopefully we get some rain and that channel can get cleared out and hopefully that culvert will function properly. On the left-hand side, we're very close to a creek area. These are all materials on site. It took us less than half an hour to kind of shore up the exit of that pipe. Try to hopefully take some pressure off of that bank so it can erode out. Next slide, please. So the NRCS has some technical guide sheets that people can use. It's some of the more practical solutions that don't require a lot of engineering assistance. And here's an example of just a log terrace pattern that potentially could be applied in a situation. Next slide, please. So this is where that actually could be used. This was a road that was cleaned and redone after the county fire in 2018. The new fire, the LNU fire, came through and knocked a few more trees down across that road. So that road's going to need to be cleared out again. And right next to it is an area that you potentially could apply something like the log terrace. It's right on site. It's right next to there. It's hard to see in the photo, on the right-hand photo, but it's a little bowled out area, and just below that that big tree in the foreground there is where the channel kind of turns into a gully and drains down that area. So it's a nice gentle slope area. You can potentially take that material from cutting that tree out and then apply it properly to the right-hand side, and hopefully that gully may not eat up back into the road and cause you some further issues. Next slide, please. Oh, and I think that's it. So the point number 5, that website you can go to, that's where our technical resources are, and some other resources on this. I think some others have pointed out too as well. But with that, we'll have questions at the end. And I am done. Thank you.
So hello, everybody. I'm Bill Birmingham with the Napa County Resource Conservation District. And a lot of what folks have already talked about with you today as far as winterization and post-fire rehab, I strongly agree with and would most likely just be repeating or reiterating. So instead of doing that, what I wanted to do is just share with you our Napa County RCD's website that we have available to you. This link will be provided to you with the resource guide that the UC folks are putting together. And the other RCDs have a similar website where if you just go onto their website and then look under resources, you'll see a tab for fire or wildfire, and then you can see a similar setup as that we have here. So I'm not going to go through everything on this page, but just wanted to point out a couple key points to you that you can look at. First and foremost is on our website, we do have this questionnaire or form that you can click on and fill out if you're interested in having us address site-specific questions for you, or if you're interested in having somebody come out onto your property. My experience with the 2017 wine country fires is that it's really important for us to be able to track the number of people that are interested in working with us. And so by having you fill out this form, we can then put you in our queue and kind of make sure that we're providing the resources that you're requesting and tracking the progress with that. About 24 people on our queue. So, and if you don't want to do that and you'd rather just reach out to us directly, there's a couple names here. There's Amanda and Evelyn with their phone numbers. And I believe if you click on their names, you'll get their email, so you could reach out to them that way. So back to originally what I was talking about, this is our RCD website. Here's the link up here for you. And it'll be made available to you through the resource guide. Here is that link where you can start to fill out this form and then be in our queue if you have specific questions or would like to have a site visit from our staff to help you with some of your resource concerns. And then also you can reach out to Amanda or Evelyn here and ask questions or ask to set up a site appointment. Also on our webpage, we have a link here for the Napa County's website, and this is more specific towards if you had homes or infrastructure that was burned and you're concerned about hazardous waste cleanup or any other developments that the county would be presenting related to the fires. So that's a great link for you to be able to utilize. And then similar to what Nick was talking about, we've got a bunch of our resource guides here that both RCD and the NRCS and the UC folks have put together. So they're here for you to click on and look at. And I just wanted to point out a couple of the ones that I think would be more relevance to folks is this Preparing for Unpaved Roads guide. This is just a quick checklist for you to kind of go through on your road infrastructure, especially focusing on the roads that would be important for you to either enter the property, enter your infrastructure, or leave the property if you need to. One of the things that we found really common with road systems after the wine country fires was a lot of melted plastic culverts. And so we strongly encourage you to go and look at those culverted areas and make sure that the plastic hasn't completely melted through. If it has, what will happen is that road fill material above the culvert becomes very unstable, especially when it gets saturated with winter rains, and will collapse either via you driving over it or just through its own heaviness. And so it can make the road impassable, or if it collapses when you drive over, it could cause injury to your vehicle or to yourself. So that's something that you really want to pay attention to. And then after this checklist, we've got a couple typical drawings here for you that kind of guide you in some road storm proofing practices. And similar to what Nick was talking about with the culverts plugging, we have this typical drawing, and this is for what we call a single post trash rack or a debris orienter that we strongly recommend installing above the inlet of these culverts. More often than not, one of those simple green T-posts will suffice as a trash rack. But in these burned landscapes, especially forest and chaparral settings, you can assume that you'll have a lot more woody material coming down these smaller steep channels for the next couple of years now that the vegetation is burned away. And so you want to ensure that you can prevent or reduce the potential for those materials to plug your culvert. And then we've got a typical drawing for rolling dips and water bar construction along your road lengths. And they also specify the spacing for these features for you. And then finally, a typical drawing for, again, for your culverted stream crossings to prevent, if this crossing were to fail and the water were to get up onto the roadbed, not having it continue down the road or divert and cause damage in other areas. So this is a typical drawing for what we refer to as the critical dip. And then next, what I'd like to kind of point out to you folks is, talked a lot about mulching and seeding in areas. And so we've got a couple of guidances for you on that. This is our RCD's post-fire seeding recommendations, and consistent with what previous speakers have said, most likely do nothing. There's an existing seed bed out there that will most likely germinate with wetting rains. I've already been out on a couple of fire site visits this year and seen some of the oaks already starting to germinate. So Mother Nature will take care of itself. It's been burning for thousands of years and will continue to do so. But if you do feel the need to seed, I would suggest that you try and focus on your infrastructure as your high priority areas and let the rest of the wildlands do their own thing. What we do recommend here for different properties is if you're in a conifer forest setting or chaparral setting, recommend that you use more of a sterile seed mix. You don't want to introduce a seed source that's going to become a continuous flashy fuel for future fires. So that's something to be aware of in those types of settings. And then for oak woodlands or grasslands, we have some seed mixes recommended that are native grass seeds. And then we provided a couple links to some of the local seed sources in the North Bay area. And I know that there's folks throughout California on this presentation, so you would have to look for your own farm supply stores in your areas for that. And then as far as seeding and mulching goes, again, we've got a typical drawing here for straw wattle installation. Straw wattles are used quite frequently here in vineyard settings to help break up the slope lengths, and they can be really effective if they're installed correctly. I won't go into the details about correct installation of straw wattles. So what I've done here instead was provide this 7-minute video for you to be able to click on. It's a YouTube video, and I find it to be very comprehensive, but yet short enough that you can view the whole thing and get a good idea about how wattles can be most effective. Again, here's those links for those farm supply seed stores for you. Plus we have erosion control vendors sort of list. Again, this is very North Bay specific that you can download and save and use for your own resources. And then we kind of have a sort of subheading here for forest and oak woodlands and some best management practices you can do in those areas. One of which I'd like to point out to you is maybe some of you are concerned about or wondering if the practices you're getting to implement needs a permit. And this is nice little quick CAL FIRE write-up, and then again, a link to their website that would give you more information about if and when you might need a permit. And then finally, what I'd just like to show you on our website is that we have some assistant programs that you can click on here and kind of get some information about their flyers and what financial assistance might be available to you. Again, if you sign up onto our list, as financial sources become available through time, we would continue to update you about that information. That's about it for me. So thank you for your time and appreciate it.
Great. This is Wendy, and we do have some questions that are rolling in. Maybe Bill, since you were just speaking, one question did come in about erosion control on slopes above and below a home. So looking at protecting a home, how would you determine if wattles and straw should be applied? Is there a degree of slope or other criteria? And then on straw, a concern about whether it would blow away. So anchoring that straw. That was a 3-part question. So there you go.
Yeah, to answer the part about if I need to mulch above or below a home, again, that's very site specific, and I would recommend that if you're comfortable with it, trying to schedule with somebody to come out and look at your property with you and discuss those parameters. Secondly, about the straw blowing away, yes, that is a significant concern and has happened to us here in Napa quite often. For hillside vineyards, the county requires that folks start to implement winterization practices after September 15th or October 15th. And oftentimes, as of late, those have been actually our very high fire seasons. And so for these properties that have burned and aren't under a ministerial date of winterization, what I would recommend is that you get those erosion control materials on site. And if you have the resources and the labor available, I would wait till the rain systems are predicted in your 10-day forecast before you start deploying those, so that you can ensure that they aren't going to blow away and that you would have to reapply them.
Great, thank you. Another couple of questions came in on just woody debris, whether in drainage, so removing woody debris from drainages, but then also would you need to worry about woody debris that's on the hill slope that might then move into a drainage. So what would be your I guess a calculus or your problem solving on that?
Yeah, the woody debris, if you're talking about woody debris in drainage systems, again, you know, the culverted stream crossings tend to be one of the higher potential areas for that debris to plug those inlets that could cause flooding onto the roadbed and divert those flows. That's why we've recommended that single post trash rack. The trash rack, what's nice about it is that the woody debris will either be oriented parallel to the culvert and can pass through it, or it'll raft along the bank and the post, leaving the inlet of the culvert open. So it does help to reduce that plug potential. The thing with woody debris, the study was done up in Humboldt and Mendocino counties years ago, and they found that 90% of the woody debris coming down the channel is at the same length as the channel width or smaller. So it's actually not a lot of really big pieces. So if you have a stream crossing or a road crossing that mimics the width of the channel bottom, most likely that woody debris will pass through. But with round culverts, they're pretty narrow at the bottom. You don't achieve your max width till halfway up the culvert. So that's where the material starts to plug. So I'd really focus on those stream crossing areas and let the woody debris in the channels that don't have any human-made infrastructure pass through on their own. And then I'm not sure if I'm still sharing my screen, but in that forest and oak woodlands subheading, there is a little guidance on there about orienting down logs and whatnot, contour to slope, so that they can act as sort of sediment barriers. And I believe that Nick had the same technical guide on his website as well. So that would help for the hill slope areas. And again, you know, for people that have a lot of acreage, really want to focus these efforts around your infrastructure as a priority, and let those other areas kind of do their own thing.
Great, thank you. We actually do have a little bit of time before our next presentation, so we can take some other questions perhaps that had come in earlier. I'm scanning through the questions to try to see which ones we can throw out.
I did see a question, Wendy, a while back. Somebody had asked about hydromulching.
Thank you.
And,
yes.
You know, we did have that experience, or that question did come up quite a bit during the 2017 fires. And I do remember seeing a study somewhere about hydromulching, and I'd have to dig it up. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I don't have a lot of experience myself with hydroseeding or hydromulching, just because the properties I work with and the grant funds I work under, it's a little cost prohibitive for us to do that. But the study did indicate that that can be effective. But the thing you want to think about with hydromulching is the vehicles that are needed to bring that material to the site. If you're using wheeled vehicles to spread out that hydromulch mix, you're actually doing a lot of soil disturbance, versus if you were on foot spreading straw out or seeding on foot, you're doing less soil disturbance. So I think the real key thing with the hydromulching stuff is to be aware that you're not doing a lot of disturbance with vehicle traffic.
Thanks. Yeah, that actually does bring up another question that came in about fire breaks that might have been put in during the firefighting effort. I think Nick spoke about this a little bit, but just the having CAL FIRE come back in to fix it. And I know that they are supposed to do that, but I know that they are also stretched really thin this year. So maybe some recommendations on looking at those fire breaks and what you can do to sort of minimize the negative effects of those fire breaks.
Yeah, in fact, I was just out on a property yesterday looking at a couple miles of dozer line that been put in across their property, and then unfortunately the resources have been pulled to go and address other fires. 2017 fires, again, my experience with those was that CAL FIRE did a pretty good job of constructing water bars along their dozer lines. Again, you know, CAL FIRE uses a lot of private contractors, so I'm sure that the quality of work is probably fairly specific to the person that was out on your property constructing those dozer lines. But that was, the dozer lines is one of the reasons why we put the, under the after the fire preparing for winter subject on our website, the typical drawings for water bars. We actually have one in Spanish as well. And the typical drawing for water bars, which is under the unpaved road section, and then a link on its own, they do give you a guidance as far as the spacing of those water bars and how they should be oriented. The spacing is relative to the slope steepness. Those are things that can be constructed by hand, but granted, if you have miles worth of dozer line on your property, it would be difficult to implement all of that on your own. And then one of the things that the water bar typicals don't have in their description, but I would recommend is if that dozer line is in fact on the ridge top or a spur ridge, it's good to kind of orient them so that one drains one way and then the next one drains the other way. We always want to think about with these disturbed areas is slowing the runoff coming off those disturbed areas, spreading that runoff out as frequently as possible and allowing it to be able to sink into the native soils without it causing rills or gullies.
I would add to that, just pay attention to what's below where you're diverting the water. So if you have a nice grassy, shallow sloped area, that'd be probably a good place to do it. If you got a really steep, bare hillside, probably not a good place to do it. And then as far as the fire lines go, the fire roads go, just prioritizing areas where you have berms and long straight runs that can gather water and gather velocity and cause issues downstream.
Great, thanks. Still have a couple more minutes. If some of our other speakers are still available, I do have some questions on the intensity of the fire and how the fire intensity affects the seed bank in the soil. I don't know if maybe Chris or Morgan or Tanya would want to take that question. I know that we are still waiting for the analysis on the fire intensity. There is a team of agencies that go in and actually map the fire intensity. So to answer that question, the question was whether the LNU complex fire was considered low or high intensity. We don't know yet, and it's probably mixed. Most fires are kind of mixed in their in the intensity, but we should be receiving those maps, I believe, or that analysis in the next week or two. It should be coming out, so we'll have a better idea of the areas that were more intensely burned. But then another question on how the intensity of the fire affects the soil seed bank. So I'm not sure if someone would want to take that.
Wendy, is my mic still active?
Yes, you are, Bill. Go ahead.
Okay, so on our RCD website under forest and oak woodlands, we do have a link that's called hydrophobic soils. And so that does talk quite a bit about what you're discussing here. And it does give you some guidances as to how you can go out and sort of look at whether or not the heat intensity was so great that it caused the soil to bake to the point where it inhibits water from infiltrating. So that's what we refer to as a hydrophobic soil. So feel free to look at that. You can also Google that sort of terminology and come up with some videos and other publications for yourselves. But what we found through our experience through looking at these fires is any areas that you have that white ash on the ground might be an area where you would think that the heat was there long enough to really kind of alter the soil structure or the organics in it. Whereas areas on the landscape where it's just blackened and you can actually still see a little bit of the needle or leaf cast on the ground, you can sort of assume that the heat wasn't enough to alter the soils. With hydrophobic soils, we've found that over time with wetting rains, those waxes that have been altered by the heat in the soil, which are making them resistant to soaking up the water, will break down with repeated rains. And so it's really a short-term phenomenon. I think with all of this stuff that we're talking about, it's really good for us all to just keep in mind that it's all about what kind of winter we're going to have after this fire. You know, after the 2017 fires, it was probably the only time that I was happy to see a drought type winter setting. We didn't get any real significant storm events or atmospheric rivers or anything like that. So we didn't have a lot of runoff and we were very fortunate. But I think, you know, given what California is experienced in the past, you really need to be aware of the storm systems that are coming through. And if it looks like it's going to be a significant storm system, please keep your own personal safety and as well as your coworkers and family in mind, and probably not visit those sites or be on those sites when those storm systems come through. There's no way of knowing or predicting what our winter is going to hold for us. So it's always good to keep that in mind. And then finally, Wendy, you mentioned the reports, which during 2017, CAL FIRE came out with, they're called WERT, W-E-R-T, Watershed Erosion Report Team. We found those to be very helpful in guiding folks about what fire severity and intensities were, as well as potentials for mud flows and debris slides. So I'm looking forward to those reports coming out as well.
Thanks. Yeah, on the question of slope stability, there was a question earlier regarding trees where the root system actually has burned out on those trees, and what the effect of that might be on slope stability. I imagine there might be some, water piping that might occur where water is actually getting down into that burnt out root system, and whether that's a major hazard or if it's just really localized, or what the effect might be on slope stability.
It definitely will be affecting slope stability. I think with those root channels being burned out, you can assume that you're going to have greater probability of erosion and concentration of flows. Again, that's really going to be consistent or looked at with the storm intensity that comes through. If we get some nice wetting, gentle rains that come through, we'll get a lot of saturation versus runoff with the high intensity rains. And that the root systems being burned out, I think, is another excellent point to think about as far as safety goes, is that, you want to be careful when you're walking around in these landscapes, because the soils may look like they're intact, but if in fact a root channel is burned out through there, you could step through something, especially if it's shortly after the fire. There may be quite a bit of heat still left in there as well. So, looking at your properties, I would try and just focus on the infrastructure that's important to you at this point, and not go out exploring much beyond that until things have had a chance to settle down and experience some rainfall and some seed germination and some greater stability.
Great, thank you. I'll have one last question before we go to our next speaker. The question is, do bioswales have any role in slope erosion control, or is that more of or less of an emergency measure?
I'm not, if I'm interpreting a bioswale correctly, it would be a feature that's constructed to be a gentle concave swale or depression, and then it's vegetated well. Those are great features for slowing down runoff and allowing it to infiltrate into the vegetation, but I don't know if that's something that would be considered at this point feasible to construct, but could be something that you could think about after this winter, and then if you need to do some long-term erosion controls next season.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Bill. And I think we'll move on to our next speaker.
All right, and thank you, Wendy and Bill and Nick. And there's one point I wanted to bring up. I saw it in the chat and some of the questions. And this webinar is pretty Napa, Yolo, Solano centric. But for those who are not in this 3-county region, what are these resources available to others? So looking at more of a statewide perspective, where can people go to find resources, local resources? Maybe someone from RCD or NRCS could chime in on that.
Yeah, so we should have some, as Bill showed on the pages for the Napa RCD and Solano RCD, there are resources posted there. We're working on finding folks who are technical resources, so arborists, specialists in erosion and sediment control, those kinds of folks as well, to connect folks with. So actually, you know, sort of as an upshot and sort of to close out that discussion, those sign-up sheets, we really want to stress that having someone come out and look at your property is really what you should do that before you make any decisions. And the RCDs and NRCS, we don't have a profit motive. We're not contractors. We're not trying to sell you anything. So we're kind of safe. And we are working on getting ourselves organized and starting to get out on the land this week and next week. So if you have signed up, you can expect to hear from us in the next couple of weeks. And we will try to get to you as soon as we can. We are limited in terms of staff numbers, but we are, you know, we're trying to get out there and see everyone and give you some on-site recommendations. So which areas should you focus your efforts on? That's going to be something you're going to want to talk with someone who's got some experience. So hang tight for that help.
Yeah, if I could add just one thing, at risk of sounding pessimistic, there have been, I've heard from a few sources that there have been already some cases of fraudulent behavior as far as helping people out or offering services that people weren't licensed for or not in the best interest. People want to do things right now. Like they want to clear their property, they want to cut down their trees, and they want to mulch everything. And I think that it's good that we all get connected. And this is what this workshop is great for, is that we're making these connections and getting this information out there. But I agree with Wendy that even though we are short-staffed, that over the next 2 to 3 weeks, that if we can at least visit and be able to connect people with those correct resources, and then maybe have some of these people that are experts actually maybe set some field days up where we can actually go visit several landowners or have something in the field that's typical of our area and answer one of those questions in the field, something like that.
All right, thank you. All right, so on to our next speaker and presentation. We're moving into a couple of presentations that can provide some information on programs and services that are available to help you with the financial aspects of recovery. And so first off, we have programs from the USDA, USDA Disaster Assistant Programs. And we have 2 speakers. We have Gizela Gover, who's the Executive Director for the USDA Farm Service Agency in Solano and Napa counties, and Scott Mahon, who is the Executive Director for same agency, USDA Farm Service Agency, but in Yolo County. So thank you very much to both of you.
Thanks, Morgan. I'll be talking first. Thanks everybody for having us. We're with the Farm Service Agency, and we've got some disaster assistance programs that are available to help producers that are affected by wildfires. So if we can go to the next slide. Our first program that's available that we'll talk about is the Emergency Assistance for Livestock and Honeybees and Farm-Raised Fish Program. It's ELAP. It was originally called the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, but it's been expanded to include honeybees and farm-raised fish. So this provides benefits for livestock feed and grazing losses due to fire on private land. So this is privately owned or cash leased or land that is held in private. It covers losses on grazing land and stored feed losses. So if you had a hay barn that had stored hay in it that burned up during the fire, we can compensate you for the loss of that. We'll be paying up to a maximum of 180 days lost in daily feed cost or daily grazing days per animal unit on the carrying capacity that's been established for the property in question. In order to be eligible for the program, you do need to contact one of our offices, whatever your local office is. My office here in Woodland covers Yolo County. If you're in Napa or Solano County, you'll be contacting Gizela in the Vacaville office. But you need to contact us within 30 days of the loss becoming apparent in order to be eligible for payment. We need to have a notice of loss on file as soon as you can. Inform us in order to be eligible. And these livestock must be, these grazing losses must be due to a commercially viable livestock operation. These are not grazing losses for pet animals or hobby farms. These are for commercial livestock operations. And in order to be eligible under the program, as usual, your adjusted gross income must be below $900,000 on average for the previous 3 years. So next slide. Okay, continuing on this program, we also have assistance for honeybee producers. So these honeybees must be used for honey production, pollination, or honeybee breeding. So once again, we're looking at commercial organizations. You know, we're looking for commercial people that are producing honeybees, honey, and raising bees for pollination purposes. We can cover colony losses, hive losses, or feed losses. So if we actually had, you know, bee boxes that were burned up, we can cover the cost of those. And we can also cover additional feed costs due to the forage around that they've been using for nectar being gone. Normal mortality on honeybees is 22%. So if there is a loss above the 22% threshold, they may be eligible for payment. For honeybees, a notice of loss needs to be filed within 15 days of the loss being apparent. So it's more important that our honeybee producers get a hold of us as quickly as possible in order to make sure that their payment eligibility is maintained. Once again, it's for a commercial operation, and adjusted gross income cannot exceed the $900,000 on average. Next slide. So we also have the livestock indemnity program. This provides benefits for livestock producers that have lost livestock due to a natural disaster, if they've been injured due to a natural disaster. Death losses have to be in excess of normal mortality. I do not have that exactly in front of me, but I believe it's between 5 and 10% for most livestock, such as cattle. And if we do have injured animals, say we have cattle that have scorched bags due to the fire, or they've lost portions of their hooves due to the fire and have to be sold at a reduced cost, we can compensate producers for the loss of value due to these. But they do have to have it notated on their sales receipt that the nature of the injury. So say if they took them to the auction yard, there would be notated that the animal was burnt or had scarring or something to that effect. Payment rates are different between different types of weight and types of animal. So cows are paid different than, say, 700-pound feeders. They're all at different rates. So you, once again, need to file a notice of loss within 30 days of the event or when loss becomes apparent. So if you have found deceased animals on your property that you have located, please make sure you contact the office as soon as possible once you have located them. We will need proof of death or proof of injury. Photos are a definite must on most of these cases. A lot of times we would prefer to have veterinary records that show the that they've been contacted, that they've witnessed and signed off on the fact that the animal is deceased, and that was the cause of the death. Once again, it has to be a commercially viable operation, and adjusted gross income needs to be below $900,000. Next slide. We have the livestock forage program, which will come into effect for federally managed lands. So BLM and Forest Service properties that we are looking at. Provides benefit to producers that are prohibited from grazing by a federal agency outside their normal permitted livestock period. So up to a maximum of 90 calendar days. We need a letter from the federal agency that states that you are prohibited from grazing during your normal time. You have to file an application within 30 days of the end of the calendar year. So an application for 2020 must be on file, and there is a typo on this. It needs to be on file by the 30th of January 2021 in order to be eligible for payment. It must be a commercially viable livestock operation, and once again, your adjusted gross income cannot exceed $900,000. And we'll move on to the next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to Gizela.
Hi, good afternoon. Okay, the Tree Assistant Program, it's TAP. This actually helps, you're eligible for trees, bushes, and vines on those from which an annual crop is produced for commercial purpose only. You can replant and rehabilitate vines destroyed or damaged by the fire. In loss of access of normal mortality is 18%. It is a cost share program. So the cost share is on the rate per vine and the land prep by acre. The rate per vine is up to like $8, depending on the planting or rehabilitation. And the land prep is $500 an acre, debris removal and ground prep, and that cost share is 50%. Okay, the deadline to sign up is within 90 days of the event or when the loss becomes apparent. I need to stress out that you can't start this project until the application is approved. So make sure you give us a call. An environmental review is required prior to the practice to start, and a field visit by an FSA is going to or not us, but the loss adjuster will be going out there to document his findings. And the average adjusted gross income cannot exceed the $900,000. Okay, next slide. The other program we have is the Emergency Conservation Program, ECP. It rehabilitates farmland and conservation structures damaged by natural disaster, so fire. It does cover debris removal, fence repair and replacement, and that can be livestock cross fences, boundary fences, cattle gates, and wildlife fence. So that is all included in that. It is possible to do a 25% advance on this practice. We also cover conservation structures, irrigation systems like water tanks, restoring or replacing. It is again a cost share program, less of 75% of the actual costs or with the agency established rates. Next slide. The deadline to sign up is, we are accepting applications now. So give us a call. Deadline will be announced later on. It is environmental review required prior to the practice start. So again, you can't start this project until the application is approved. So make sure you take lots of pictures And if you can't get into your property and you have to move the debris, just put it to the side and then, you know, drive through, but make sure you take lots of pictures. Payment limitation is $500,000 per person. So it's up to $500,000, and there's no AGI requirements. Next slide. Emergency loans is another something we offer. It's low interest loans available in a disaster declared counties and contiguous counties. It's various loan option program available. Must be at least 30% loss. You must be unable to obtain commercial loans. So you must have proof of a denial form from 2 to 3 different banks. Okay, and we do have low rates, but they change monthly. So after conversing with your loan officer, they can discuss what the rate would be at that time. The deadline to sign up is within 8 months of the disaster. And again, you need to apply at your local FSA county office. Next slide. Okay, and this is just more information. Your local FSA office in Mendocino and Lake counties, you go to Ukiah. Napa, you come here to Vacaville. Sonoma, you would go to Petaluma. Yolo, you would go to Woodland. And that's what Scott. There is websites on here and fact sheets for all our programs. We currently are not open to the public, so please give us a call, and you can locate these offices with phone numbers on the website. We do have an office locator, so you can get that number. And I believe that is it.
Great, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Gizela. A couple of quick questions. I know that we're tight on time a little bit, but there were several questions. First, about eligibility, what constitutes a commercial operation, and then also on timelines, how quickly could folks expect to receive funding through these programs?
So how quickly could we see funding? It depends on how soon we can actually get all our damage assessments done and get through the initial phase of things. We can take applications without having funding, and quite often we can approve practices that need to, need immediate assistance. We can approve them prior to actually having funding and then fund them later. These are cost share programs such as the emergency conservation program. It's a 75% cost share up to the set rate that we have. But we have to request funding from the national office. We have to do a damage assessment. We have to do an initial estimate of the cost, and we will be taking sign up as soon as we get approval from the national office on what we can do there. I don't foresee there being much of a problem with this case, as we have been given a presidential disaster declaration. But in order to get all our ducks in a row, we need to have a county emergency board meeting and then, send our request up to national office. But I don't foresee that being too far in the future. I'm hoping that we can start taking sign up as soon as possible. And then for a commercially viable livestock operation, we're not looking at somebody that has 3 alpacas in their backyard that they have for lawn ornaments. We have to, in order to be commercially considered a commercial operation, you're going to have sales of livestock or sales of product of livestock that actually show that you're raising them for commercial purposes, not just as a pet. And
that would apply to
purposes.
That would apply to tree fruit kind of tree and vine assistance
Yes.
as well.
Once again, you need to be a commercial producer in order to be eligible for most FSA programs.
Okay, but there's not like a dollar value on that sale. So even if you're a small scale
I mean,
producer.
there is, but I do not know that number right off the top of my head.
I just want to add a quick thing. It does have to be delivered to a processor, so we would need those documentations.
Okay, thank you. All right, and we'll move on. Thank you so much, and hope you will stay to answer any additional questions after the last presentation. Thank you.
For sure, and if anybody has any other questions, please don't hesitate to call our offices. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott and Gizela. All right, moving on to our next presentation. This is going to be on property value and tax reassessment. And for that, we have John Tuteur, who is the Napa County Assessor. And John is also, he has personal experience with fire. It happened on his ranch in Napa County in the 2017 Atlas fire. So John, thank you for being on this and providing information.
Morgan, happy to be aboard. I was very pleased with the service we got from the Farm Service Agency and as well as from Bill Birmingham and the RCD who came out and went over the property with us after the October 2017 fires. I'm here today in my assessor capacity to talk about what is available for people. We're primarily focused on improvements that were lost, structures, homes, barns. We do have some responsibility for vineyards that were actually burned. Smoke taint and those issues are not quite as related to what we do. So the first thing is that we need a calamity application. They're available on our website. We prefer if someone from Napa County will contact me at the address shown on the screen, or if they will call or let us know that they've suffered damage to their property. We have approximately 250 to 300 structures, residential structures damaged in Napa County. So once we get the calamity application, there are two things that happen. As long as your mortgage company does not pay your loan for you with an impound account, you may postpone the first payment of your property taxes, which is normally due December 10th, until we send you a corrected bill reflecting the loss of assessed value because of the damage to the property. We are giving some temporary land loss to cover the cost of debris removal and hazardous waste cleanup. It's about 35%. And then, of course, the structure will still show some value for the first year because you had the use of it during the month of July before it burned down in August. But in following years, there'll be no structure value until you begin to rebuild. The second thing is that you're protected by a base year value restraint so that if you build essentially the same home back, you will get your old base year value from Proposition 13 before that home burned down. And we can help with that in making sure that you know what the rules are. The second thing you can do is if you decide not to rebuild, you may move your base year value from the property that burned down elsewhere in Napa County. You get up to 120% of the value of the property the day before it burned down. And then if you stay within that limit with the property you buy, we'll move your base year value directly. If you go over 120%, then the difference between 100% to 120% and what you actually paid for the replacement property gets added to your old base year value. So you still receive that Prop 13 protection. And that also applies for damage in Napa County. There are 13 other counties across California who will accept your base year value from Napa County, including Solano, Sonoma as neighboring counties, and other counties both in the Bay Area and throughout the state. Finally, I just wanted to mention in my role as Registrar of Voters that there are 3 ways in which people who have lost their homes can still get their ballots, which will be going out the week of October 5th in Napa County and in most of the other counties surrounding us. They can either pick up their mail at their post office, even though their home's been destroyed, and continue just to get their ballot at the post office and vote from where they are. They can supply us by email or telephone with a mailing address if they've created a PO box, or if they've gone to a rental unit but want to vote from where their home was when it was destroyed. So they can give us a mailing address and the ballot will be mailed to that address. And finally, if they are moving, even on a temporary basis, and want to vote from where they're moving, they can re-register online up until October 19th of 2020 and still receive a vote by mail ballot at that new address, and that ballot will be for that location where they moved to, not the location of the house that was destroyed. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you, John. There have not been any questions that have come in on the chat, or excuse me, on the Q&A. We will keep an eye on that for you and direct those if they do come in. I'm hoping that the rest of our panelists are still here and available for some other questions that are still hanging out.
Yeah, I do have a question for John.
Oh, go ahead, Morgan.
Sure. So the calamity, I think you said a calamity application that someone can apply or submit in Napa County. Is the process the same in other counties?
Yes, all counties treat calamities the same. It's a very simple program. We do not, and you can only get assessed value off what we assess. So I saw a question coming in as to whether there was a break for wildland or grazing. The assessor normally does not assess grass or trees or vegetation. So there's usually no break there. It's only when there is an improvement that was on the tax roll, like a vineyard or a house or a barn, where that program really works for you. And you have to have suffered that kind of a loss also to defer the first installment of your property tax payments. That is not available to people who just suffered vacant land or grazing losses. That doesn't qualify for the calamity.
Okay, an additional question did come in. Someone spoke with the assessor at the Solano County Fire Victims Fair and is asking if they still need to complete that calamity application.
Yes, it's always best to have a calamity application on file. The assessor in our county, and it's not automatic, the Board of Supervisors has to give the assessor that authority, can institute a calamity application on his or her own motion. But there's a year to file the calamity application. We urge people, as someone said, they're eager to get going, to file it soon, especially if they want to postpone the first installment of their property taxes, because that application does have to be in to me by December 10th, the due date, the delinquency date of the first installment of property taxes. So there is some need to get moving if you're going to file a property tax calamity. I see a question. It doesn't take as long to do the reevaluation. That's why you get to defer the first installment of your taxes as long as your mortgage company doesn't pay your taxes. So as soon as we get the calamity application, we get jumping on it and we begin to take the process. So within 30 days from now, I would expect that the first notices of roll correction will be going out, showing the decline in value for the loss of the structure. Remember, there'll still be 1/12 of the value of the structure on that bill. And it'll also show the interim decline in the land value. That land value will revert to its full base year value for the 2021 tax year, but it will be lowered by the 35% for the balance of this tax year.
All right. Thank you, John. I'm going to switch to our post-webinar question and answer session. So I'm hoping all of our panelists are available, and I'm going to try to call folks out so you can unmute yourselves as I'm asking the question. There were quite a few questions on managing for weeds and specifically for yellow star thistle. So I'm going to ask if maybe Morgan, Chris, or Tanya can talk about strategies or maybe point us to some resources on yellow star thistle and other weed control.
So yeah, I can jump in on this. So for yellow star thistle control, if it's a pretty serious infestation over a pretty broad area, many times it's the most effective strategy is going to be use of an herbicide. And one of the newer herbicides that we have available is Milestone, and it's use a pretty low rate of that product for yellow star thistle control. I think the lowest rate on the label is about 3 ounces per acre. And it's very effective on yellow star thistle. The time period to use that is starting about January, February. It can go as early as maybe late December. And what Milestone does is it will kill the seedlings that are present at the time, but it also has some soil residual activity, meaning it has a pre-emergent activity. So those seeds that haven't yet germinated, as they germinate, the herbicide that's present in the soil will kill those seedlings as they emerge. So it's pretty effective. And like I was saying, this is probably a good opportunity to implement some strategy like that. If star thistle has been bad, you want to try to get rid of it. You're going to have a big flush of it this year. But the thing is that you will extinguish a lot of seeds in the seed bank, but not all of the seeds. And so it's not something that you can accomplish in just 1 year. So it's going to take probably 2 or maybe even better yet, 3 consecutive years to extinguish that seed bank. And then you can get to the point where you can manage it. We're never going to eradicate star thistle, but hopefully we can manage it. And the best way to manage it is with some revegetation strategies to get something there, establish something else that can compete with yellow star thistle. And in projects that I've been involved in, what competes really well with yellow star thistle are the perennial grasses, whether annual or exotic perennial grasses. Annual grasses, they establish quickly, but their rooting system isn't perhaps deep enough to compete really well with star thistle. And so if you really want to establish something, and maybe, and I'm sure Tanya and Chris can probably say more about this on those revegetation strategies, but that's what, that could be a strategy, but once again, very strategic because revegetation is a costly practice. So I'll leave it there. Let Chris and Tanya chime in.
Well, I posted a link to the Weed Research and Information Center's fact sheet on star thistle. So that has all different treatments. I would say if you are using herbicide and you do want to seed grass seeds so that you can use broadleaf herbicides to kill the star thistle. And then you'll promote your grasses and you won't kill the poppies that you just maybe have planted.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to ask our FSA folks to come back on. There's a couple of questions on programs. First one is, does loss of grazing acreage qualify as a feed loss? So loss of standing forage on rangeland.
It qualifies as a loss of grazing. So it's a loss of grazing days. And it's at your established carrying capacity on that property. If you've participated in the livestock forage program before for drought, it's going to correlate to the same carrying capacity as that.
And that would be under the
it would be under the
forage.
Emergency Livestock and Honeybees and Farm-Raised Fish Program.
Okay.
ELAP is the acronym that we use for it.
Thank you. Another question is on assistance for crop loss due to smoke damage on grapes.
At this time, we do not have anything for the 2020 year. We do have the WHIP Plus program that includes the 2018 and 19 crop seasons. and smoke taint was included in those. But as of right now, we do not have a program for 2020 yet. You know, that is up to the national office as to whether or not they will implement that for another year now. But as of right now, we do not have anything other than general crop insurance to help with that.
Okay. Thank you. I'm scanning through for other unanswered questions. Sorry, there's a lot of questions. I'm having trouble sort of sorting out which ones have already been answered. Let's see. There was a question about fire breaks. If there's a recommended width for fire breaks, and that might be more of like a fire prevention rather than a post-fire question. But I don't know if there's someone, maybe Bill or Nick, if you can comment on a recommended width for fire breaks.
I don't know of any, actually, I don't know what the actual definition or fire breaks are. I know that for structures, they have a different recommendation versus a road, or I believe any sort of fire break you can get would be beneficial. A minimum probably 10 feet, but Bill probably knows actually.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question for your local CAL FIRE person to come out and assess with you on your property. It does have a bit to do with width, but it's also slope position where you decide to put that fire break. You're going to have much more effectiveness if you're putting your brakes at the top of the slope versus at the bottom or mid slope. Always something to consider with wildfires is that they primarily spread through spotting. So you'll have an active flame front, but in front of that, the vegetation is establishing spot fires. So fire breaks can be very effective if the weather conditions are in your favor. But as we experienced with, for example, the wine country fires through Santa Rosa, that fire jumped over Highway 101, which is 6 to 8 lanes wide. So those are very high wind conditions. And so I would just kind of caution you to think about fire weather in accordance with establishing these fire breaks. And again, contact your local CAL FIRE person and they can kind of come out onto your property and assess where those locations would offer you the best benefit.
Great, thank you. And also thinking about soil disturbance as well. So not putting in fire breaks unnecessarily, causing soil disturbance as well. A question for Kat. Are you still here with us? There was a question on citrus, and I know that you don't generally work with citrus too much, but there was a question about citrus trees where the bark has peeled away from the cambium, and assessing those. Would it be a similar assessment?
Yeah, so I will say that from what I know from down south, where citrus has been much more on the margin of these fire impacts, that citrus has a thinner bark than, say, walnuts or the oaks, than a lot of trees, and so damage to citrus is much more likely. If the bark is peeling back, that does indicate to me that you probably damaged your cambium there and that the tree won't, or at least that tissue won't recover in the future. However, if it's less than 50% of the circumference of the trunk, it's quite possible that that tree can bounce back. So I would still use a wait and see approach into the spring to see just how much the tree can bounce back from that damage.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to go for we're almost at that 12:30 mark. We have a few more questions here, so if folks are okay with hanging out for a few more minutes, I think we can get through most of the questions.
Hey, Wendy, can I make a statement real quick?
Absolutely.
Just for everybody's reference, with the emergency conservation program, so that'd be for debris removal, fences, irrigation structures, and everything. It is extremely important that you do not do anything but possible debris removal just to get into your property. Please don't start anything without contacting us so that we can do an environmental assessment, because if you do start work prior to the environmental assessment, we more than likely will have to deny your claim and will not be able to assist you with cost share. So it's very important that you contact us before you do anything besides initial debris removal just to get into the property. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
And Wendy,
Yeah. Yes.
and since it is the 12:30 mark, I just, we can continue on with the question and answers, but some people may have to start getting off. And I just wanted to just get a little bit of information out before people do. And I, first of all, just want to thank everyone for attending. Hope it was informational for you and valuable for you. And thank you to all of our presenters and organizing group for pulling all this together in a short amount of time. The responses that you're providing to our poll questions are very helpful and will help inform us on additional webinars and more focused webinars that we can provide to all of you based on that feedback. We will provide and send out a resource guide. So basically a compilation of lots of different resources. You've seen some coming up on the screen in the chat, and we'll have additional resources in a guide or just a couple of pages that we'll send out and share with everyone. And also, which just went up in the chat, is a link to an evaluation. It's basically an online survey. And please complete that. There are some more questions in there that will help us and many of the agencies respond to some of the issues that you may have in your particular county, your particular area. So with that, we can thank you, and we'll continue on with the question and answer.
Okay, great. So if Rich Casale, if you're still on the line, we did have a question on erosion control on a near vertical hillside. And my 2 cents would be what's below that hillside before you invest a lot of time and money on it. But Rich, if you're there and maybe talk about some of the best management practices you might recommend in that case.
Sure. Again, if the steep hillside is near an important structure that hasn't burned, or even a house site or a structure that burned and you're still trying to protect that building area, it may also be next to a road or a driveway or a utility or something that you're trying to protect. There would be a reason for providing protection to that steeper slope. If it's too steep for just bare straw protection, I always like to go to straw first. It's least expensive, and by all the research and from all the years of my experience, evaluating straw after a fire and through the first winter following fire, it's just as effective as erosion control blankets and hydro mulch and all the other really expensive measures for steep slope protection. You can tuck the straw in using a shovel or a spade on steeper slopes. You can use netting like jute netting. I'm not a big fan of the plastic netting because we have issues with wildfire, wildlife, snakes, even deer can get tangled up in netting that's put down over a slope. It can be a hazard. Erosion control blankets can be a hazard in the same fashion. They also leave a residue on the slope afterwards, so that can be a pollution issue. Some are completely biodegradable, but it's over time. So if you do go to an erosion control blanket or a netting, as I mentioned in my presentation, you have to have a uniform slope. There's a lot of soil prep that goes along with those practices. So you'll be making a lot of disturbances that may not be worthwhile at the end of the day. I like to see less disturbance, Rice straw has been mentioned over the course of this training today. It is relatively weed-free. Nothing is 100%. We just don't know how it's, where it's being stored, how it's being transported, you know, all sorts of other ways that weed could be, other weed seed can contaminate it. But I have to mention that rice straw is light and fluffy. It's more prone to movement by wind. It's also difficult to spread, and some people get real lazy when they're spreading rice straw because you got to pick it apart, and you only want no more than 2 inches on the surface. You don't want to be throwing flakes out there unless you're using those, as I believe Bill was talking about, as a form of a straw wattle. So there's ways that you can use straw on the slope. You can even dig a small trench and actually pack straw into it for it to kind of act like a straw wattle on a steep slope. I would, if you're going to do anything structural like that on a slope, I would do it, you know, like at the bottom to protect the area that you're trying to protect from runoff and sedimentation. Maybe one at the top if there's overland flow that's going to be influencing this steep slope. A lot of times at the top of the slope, there's no reason for one, but I see people put them at the top of the slope anyway, but they're kind of high and dry when you do that. I like, as you can tell, I like the lower tech practices, and not only because they're cheaper, but they're just as effective. And unfortunately, you know, contractors get out there and they sell folks on these very expensive measures, and they're not really getting any more bang for their buck. So seeding may be appropriate close to structures and roads as well, but, you know, using a sterile annual grass seed. Native grasses are slower to germinate. They're good for the second season following fire mostly, but you can start them out in this first season. But I always like to encourage some sort of a fast-growing, sterile cereal grain as a nurse crop to go along with that. And we have a couple of seed mixes. We're working with some local dealers here down in Santa Cruz County to help people with seed selection on a steep slope. But anyway, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Rich. Yeah, in the Q&A, the person clarified that the steep slope is above a driveway. So yeah, definitely access is one of the things we want to try to protect.
And you know, this winter is a good time. It's a dormant period of time to start landscape plants if it's someplace not only for aesthetics, but on steeper slopes. Grass really doesn't do that much for slope stability. It's more of a surface erosion control plant. You want to start looking at plants that have root systems that are going to give long-term stability for a steep slope that's been affected by fire or from the firefighting effort, like road banks and road fills and around home sites and that sort of thing.
Thank you, Rich.
Sure.
All right, I think one last question, and it's going to go to Kat. There is a question about advice or guidelines on remedial pruning of fire-damaged orchard trees or vines. Should dead wood be removed? And if so, when? And should oaks be pruned? So maybe Mike, if he's still on, he could jump in on the oaks and pruning.
Yeah, so that remedial pruning, I would say, still waiting until a month after normal leaf out, because the trees can really surprise you how much of that tissue can grow back. And what might look a little water soaked and damaged may push through. So I would wait until about a month after leaf out before you do any severe pruning. Yeah. But then I guess another thing to add is that you do want to prune out that dead wood eventually, because it can harbor fungal diseases, that sort of thing that can infect other healthy tissue. And I'll throw it to Mike regarding oaks.
Yeah, Mike, if you're still on, any advice on pruning oaks?
Yeah, so generally it's not advisable to prune oaks. They don't typically respond well. However, if they're within your defensible space and you're removing ladder fuels, you can prune lower branches. It's best to do it when they're dormant, so in the late fall, early winter. so that you're not spreading diseases. And you don't want to prune too much because you can impact, if you prune more than a third of their canopy, you can really impact structural stability and their ability to kind of persist with that much damage. So typically it's best not to touch the oaks, especially on the landscape. And they are really good at kind of dropping dead branches. So just let them naturally kind of recover and drop their fire affected branches. And then your role as a landowner would be to, like, if you're worried about the fuels built up on the floor, remove those material. But as far as touching the trees, it's best to leave them alone.
All right, thank you. Well, we are at 10 minutes past our closing time. So I just wanted to throw out a little bit, Bill reminded me, on the fire prevention and fire resilience. I know that's maybe not first on our minds, but the resource conservation districts in Yolo, Solano, and Napa counties are all working with local landowners on in fire safe councils and prescribed burn associations, trying to organize folks to do that preventative land management to help ward off the worst effects of the wildfire. I don't think we're ever going to stop wildfires from happening, but we could probably do a better job of helping folks get that land management work done ahead of time. So as you're sort of talking with us and having folks come out to your property, if you are interested in being a part of that, either a prescribed burn association or a fire safe council in your local area, please talk to us about that. We are trying to organize in that way. So that's it for me. I'll turn it back to Morgan.
All right, thanks, Wendy. I'll just add that on the evaluation, there should be a couple of questions on there about interest in a prescribed burn association and fire safe council. So please complete that survey. It'll help us, like I said, inform future programs. And a couple of questions I saw in the chat that didn't make its way to the question and answer. I can go ahead and address. There are questions about milestone. Is it a broadleaf herbicide? And it is. It does affect broadleaf plants, but not all broadleaf plants. It's very effective against plants in the sunflower family, and but it also has impact. Can kill plants in the legume family, so in the clover, pea type plants, as well as plants in the tomato family, so the Solanaceae family. And since it does have this residual activity, meaning that it lingers in the soil, is that there are some restrictions on the use of manure from animals that have grazed lands that have been where milestone has been applied. You don't want to use that manure in a compost. If you use it in a compost and it goes into your garden, you're going to see your beans aren't going to grow, your tomatoes aren't going to grow. So just be cautious of that. And it's on the label, indicates on the label those precautions. And the question was about what's in milestone, and the active ingredient is aminopyrrolid, but that's about all I know what it is. It is one of the low risk, one of the few low risk herbicides that are available on the market, and very effective on thistle plants. All right, so with that, I think we can close the session out. We thank you, and we'll use the feedback that you're giving us with the poll questions and the evaluation, like I said, to look at future programming for you. And many thanks go to the UC Agriculture and Natural Resources Program Support Unit for all the behind the scenes magic and making it all work. I think it's worked quite well. So very appreciative of all your efforts. And thank you to everyone, all the presenters and organizers. And with that, take care, and we all wish you the best of luck in all of your recovery efforts.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck. Contact us with questions.